It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marianna Orlandi. Marianna Orlandi received her PhD in law from the University of Padua, Italy, and from the University of Innsbruck, Austria. Prior to moving to Texas, she was a James Madison Associate Research Scholar and a lecturer in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. She is the Executive Director of the Austin Institute and will offer the opening remarks. Now we can welcome her.
She just said it. All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Ruiz. Nobody introduced Dr. Ruiz, but she's at the Austin Institute. We're very lucky to have her as the Director of Curriculum and Education, which is why most of you already know her, and most of you already know me, I think, too. But anyway, it's my pleasure to give you a good morning and the welcome remarks to our conference. So it is on behalf of all the staff and of also all the people that have supported us now for more than a decade, supported our work here in Austin, that I want to thank you all for joining us today. And I would like to start these remarks by welcoming each one of you, but I promise I'm not going to do it by name, even though I know a lot of you. I just want to talk about the different groups that we have here. So I do want to start with all the college students, and thank you for coming up here on a Saturday morning in between finals. I understand. I have been a student multiple times. But I do promise you that you will not regret having attended today's conference. When we decided to host this conference, when we selected the speakers, when we thought about the topics, you were the main audience we had in mind. So this conference is for you, as most of our work is. I then want to, of course, welcome the professionals, the ones who are engaged, those who are married, we have some newlyweds, the ones who are dealing with some situationships, and probably above all, the ones who are currently looking for a spouse and would love to get married and to have kids, but they are stuck in a culture that is both societal and personal too, that deals poorly with commitment. So that's probably the place where you should be right now. And last, I want to welcome anyone who's a parent here. And of course, your presence shows how much you care about certain topics. But it is particularly important to us because at the Institute, we all think that the cultural shifts that have taken place over, yes, the past 60 years, but most importantly in the past 20 years, are so dramatic that any parent who truly wants to help his kids grow, and by grow I also mean finding love and having a family, must receive some formation too. So now, I would predict my dad would say, some formation? Really? Do we need to learn about Adam and Eve? Isn't that the same thing? Hasn't it always been the same? The man falls in love, the woman falls in love, they like each other, they fall in love, babies come, that's it, right? There shouldn't be anything that we need to learn and to receive formation on. But the answer is wrong. We do need to receive formation. Besides the decline in marriage and in childbearing, not even the number of relationships today is increasing. And somehow the new world in which we live seems to have put an end to what we thought was the most innate human drive. Human person, Aristotle calls it the social animal, and we do a lot of social media, but I do think we're not really social anymore. And even if our sexual drive still exists and remains, the way people engage in sex today is dramatically different from anything humanity saw before. Now, I hope you are reading the news on your own, and that I do not need to state what is obvious. So I hope I do not need to stress that online pornography has done to what that has done to sex is simply unprecedented in human history. just as is the certainty that the sexual intercourse can be completely sterile. So we live in a new scenario. All these changes are then the main reason why we constructed this conference. Young people do not need to be told what they should or should not do with their life. Also, it never works. Like, it hasn't worked on any of us, I think, at this table. What they need to do is to understand what they think and why they think it. So we realize this by working with them every day, is that, first of all, young people need to reflect on what their opinions are and why they came to those conclusions that they think they hold so dear. So if they truly want to postpone marriage, fine. But why? Why is that the case? What are the unspoken assumptions about life, about happiness, about love? And older people, at the same time, especially if we, and I put myself in that group at this point, if we want to be good mentors, good role models, we need to understand better the thoughts and habits and the social environment of today. So, as an example, I would argue that if we really understand how dating apps work and how they wire our brains, making us think not only of the other, but also of ourselves as a product, which may or may not be selected, we may not suggest to our kids to get on the apps, not even on the purest and most chaste apps that are out there. And if we tune in to what young people currently think about sex, marriage, and children, we may also decide as parents to talk less about what's the college you want to attend or what's the future of artificial intelligence, maybe talk more about purpose and meaning of life. So all of these things, this need to understand where the culture stands and where mistakes hide, are the reasons why we decided to host this conference, and they're also the reason why we've invited the 3 amazing speakers that you're going to meet today. For those who know us, we are a small reality, so this is a big conference for us and a big effort, but we also know that is the kind of effort that best describes the nature of what we do every day, every week, and we've been doing for the past 13 years. So in Austin, we do formation and research, right? We're both a research and a formation organization. So it's clear that we will be doing some formation today because you will hear from the speakers and their insights and their thoughts. But so what about the research? Where's the research part? Well, our research is characterized not only by the interviews and the studies, but also by a very attentive listening to our attendees, that are students and professionals, to our reading groups and programs and seminars. And so it's because of those reflections, it's because of what we hear from them that we have decided to shape the conference the way we did. Our take is that a good portion of the people, all ages, has lost or is losing sight of some fundamental premises that come way before we tell someone you should get married and have kids. What are these premises? Just some of them. Proper understanding of of our embodiment, of the human body, right? Nowadays, the body is very much used, very much shaped, but rarely treasured. Second premise is familiarity with the fact that we are social and relational by nature. And so we need to do something in that regard. Third premise, and what seems to me, the gravest and that has been lost, is a sense of purpose. Our lives need a purpose. What is it? Which one is it? If the answer that we receive of what is worth living for is travels, we wonder, what are you going to look at pictures of travels when you're 80? Question. Answer can be yes. So with today's conference, what we want to stress is the importance of these premises. With our first guest, Serena Sigillito, we will start to look more deeply at the anthropological question of what is the anthropological frame we are working with. With our second guest, Patrick Brown, we will address one of the main reasons people cite to stay away from marriage, which is usually that it costs a lot. Is that really so? That's the question. Is life as a single person really that much easier, cheaper? And with our third guest, the one that you need to fill that form for, Dr. Breuninger, we will address maybe a more psychological phenomenon, but one that we think is nowadays central to the crisis of marriage. What we've detected, and studies have shown that on a broad scale, is that young people who say they will eventually want to get married and have kids do say that first they need to be ready, they need to be healed. So healing wounds is a great idea, it's a great healthy intention, but the question is it always good? Or are people imposing some really impossible standards on themselves? So we know that 3 panels for all these things will not be enough. Nothing is ever enough, but they might be the right starting point and the necessary one. So I do want to mention one last thing about the importance of this day. I would encourage you all to think back of one person, one book, one movie that you remember because it changed somehow the course of your life. And it happens multiple times in life, right? And those are very small moments that just make us either move forward more courageously on the way in which we already are, because we have a confirmation that that's exactly the way to go, or they make us pause, reflect, and think that maybe we're not exactly moving in the right direction. So we do hope that this conference will be one such moment for at least some of you. And with that, I think I should let Dr. Ruiz introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orlandi, for your remarks and your words. It is now my honor to introduce our first speaker, Serena Sigillito. Serena is a writer and the founding editor of the journal Theater Disputations. She's also the former editor and a current contributing editor at Public Discourse, the journal of the Witherspoon Institute. Her first book, Saving the Second Sex, will be published in March 2027 by Penguin Random House. She's a wife and a mother of 3 daughters. Her talk is called Swipe Left on Isolation, Reclaiming Embodied Relationality in a Frictionless Age. With that said, please welcome Serena.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Ruiz and Dr. Orlandi. I'm really, really grateful to be here. And I think we're all here today because we sense that there's a problem, and that it's a big one. We know that the problem has something to do with sex, dating, and marriage. That much is clear. But once you start to actually name and define the problem, much less to propose answers to that problem, things start to get a lot more complicated. For one thing, there's a lot of different lenses through which you can try to understand what's going on. One really fruitful way that I think the Austin Institute is very dedicated to is to kind of analyze and quantify the problem using social science. So you can cite statistics about the skyrocketing rates of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and isolation that plague young people today. You can point to plummeting rates of not only big life events like getting married and having kids, but also more mundane everyday acts, like asking someone out on a date, going to a party, or even just hanging out in person with your friends. You can also describe the problem in more personal, emotional terms. You could say that it feels like it's getting harder and harder for us to know how to interact with each other. You could say that we struggle to form deep, intimate friendships and solid, stable, life-giving romantic relationships. You could also say that we have lost the social scripts that used to structure our lives together. And all of those descriptions of the problem would be true. Just think about the kind of 1950s era sitcoms, musicals, and movies. Something like Bye Bye Birdie or Happy Days, or Leave It to Beaver. So back then, if a guy and a girl liked each other, they knew exactly who was supposed to do what. The guy was supposed to ask the girl out on a date. She's supposed to say yes, get dolled up, and let him hold the door for her and pay for dinner. Her role was to act as the gatekeeper, to assess whether or not this guy was boyfriend material. If she thought he was, then after a certain amount of time, they'd officially begin going steady. There were rituals and a language to describe this progression, like a boy giving a girl his class ring or his Letterman jacket, to publicly signify that they were an item, that she was no longer on the market. After high school graduation, it was expected that they would soon get engaged, get married, buy a house, and start having kids. Now, there are plenty of things to critique about this era, and I'm absolutely not advocating that we need to try to bring back the 1950s. I'm glad that we live in a time when women are legally protected from employment discrimination, that we have equal opportunities for education, and that we don't need to try to fit ourselves into an artificially constraining vision of femininity. Still, I do think that any honest accounting of our relational problems has to begin by acknowledging that love and marriage have been disrupted by a series of seismic societal shocks. First, beginning back in the 1960s and 70s, there was the sexual revolution and the women's rights movement. More recently, we've gone through the invention of the smartphone, the rise of social media and online dating, and the gradual migration of more and more of our lives from the physical world to the digital one. Although many individual people do continue to form happy marriages and have healthy family lives, on a broad societal level, men and women have not yet figured out how to relate to one another in this brave new world, a world that has been radically reshaped by these successive social revolutions. As Patrick Brown will discuss later this morning, women are no longer economically dependent on men. Sex is no longer confined to committed relationships. Committed romantic relationships are no longer a sure path to marriage and family life. And in-person social networks are no longer the place where most people meet their sexual partners. Even though many of those changes at least began to take place before you college students were born, your generation is the one that's grappling with and suffering from their full effects. Your parents and grandparents fought for freedom, autonomy, individuality, and self-determination, and those are very good and important things. But now I fear the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction. Rather than suffering because we live in a society that hems us in with oppressive social scripts, heavy-handed moral judgments, and institutions that demand obedience and conformity, today we're suffering from a lack of clarity and structure. The baby boomers, like my own hippie parents, wanted to stick it to the man. But today, when it comes to sex, dating, and marriage, there's no man left. There's no longer a cultural consensus surrounding sexual ethics, other than the bare minimum standard of obtaining verbal consent from your partner. Unless you grew up in a particularly conservative religious subculture, there's probably nobody pressuring you to settle down and get married early, or maybe even at all. On the contrary, you will be subject to social and economic pressures that will tend to nudge you into prioritizing your education and your career over your relationships. You're going to gain social status if you choose to move across the country to pursue a lucrative job opportunity after graduation. If, on the other hand, you decide to turn down a prestigious graduate program or a high-paying consulting job so that you can get married and settle down in your early 20s, tying yourself down to a particular place and a particular person, people are probably going to think that's pretty strange. In other words, even if you actually want the proverbial house in the suburbs with the white picket fence, the 1950s-style marriage with the breadwinning husband and the homemaking wife, and the 2.5 smiling children, that is no longer the cultural default. It's not just going to happen to you if you go with the flow and imitate your peers. Today, marriage and family life are goals that you must actively pursue by making a series of difficult and increasingly countercultural choices. If you do not actively choose otherwise, the architecture of our modern life is such that you will spend a great deal of your time over the next decade alone, looking at a screen, rather than spending it building deep, meaningful, and lasting relationships. Okay, you guys look pretty depressed. So I'm going to pause and acknowledge that I'm painting a really gloomy picture right now. And my goal is not to depress you. But I do want you to know what you're up against. So I said earlier that there are a lot of different ways to describe this problem. In the rest of my talk this morning, I'm going to try to offer you a different lens through which to look at our relationship problems. One that's probably a lot less familiar to you than that of social science. That lens is philosophical anthropology. So philosophical anthropology is just a fancy term for our theories, our questions, and our beliefs about what it means to be human. Our ideas about what it means to be human, in turn, shape our ethics, our intuitions, and the standards by which we make choices about what it means to live a good life, what we think it means to do human well. I believe that many of the most difficult and painful issues that you will have to grapple with in your personal life stem from the same basic philosophical question. And that problem is the widespread acceptance of a false understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to live a good life. But here comes the good news. I'm going to argue that you and I have the capacity and the agency to help solve this big cultural problem through the choices that we make in our personal lives. We can do this, first, by understanding, accepting, and then seeking to live out a better and truer philosophical anthropology. Okay, so full disclosure, I am a suburban mom in my 30s, and I freely admit that I'm a little bit out of touch with what goes on college campuses these days. But even I know that most people don't spend a lot of time sitting around and thinking about what it means to be a person. But even so, I do think that all of us spend our days using technology, living within built environments, interacting within social networks, and working or studying within institutions that all take for granted a certain idea about the person who's using that technology, or living in that dorm room, or jockeying for status within that social milieu, or earning that degree. And I think that we absorb those ideas unconsciously. Then we make choices and we form habits that reinforce those ideas and shape who we become. So that's why I think it's so important for us to stop and actually examine the assumptions by which we're living. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on 3 essential aspects of what I'm going to argue is a true philosophical anthropology. So those 3 things are embodiment, interdependence, and sexual difference. I'm going to focus on those 3 things, not because they're the only true things that we could say about what it means to be a person, but because they are 3 really important things that our culture often gets wrong. And getting these 3 things wrong has real consequences. When we make choices based upon a mistaken understanding of the good life, one that's based on false ideas about who and what we are, we just end up hurting ourselves and each other. If we want to be able to build authentic and meaningful relationships with one another, we need to begin by following the command of the ancient Greek oracle at Delphi: know thyself. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to give you just a brief overview of these 3 concepts. Again, that's embodiment, interdependence, and sexual difference. And I'm going to explain how these abstract concepts might show up in your real life. I'm also going to suggest a few ideas for concrete actions that you can take to live them out. I'm going to acknowledge up front that I'm making a lot of truth claims here and normative statements. And in the Q&A prayer period and our conversations, I'm happy to kind of delve more into arguments and ideas backing those up. There is a long historical and philosophical conversation and arguments about these ideas, so we can delve into different thinkers like Aristotle or Descartes or Kant or Simone de Beauvoir. There's lots there. But I'm also happy to take this in more concrete terms, to think through how these bad ideas show up in our lives and how we can combat them. So as I say, right now I'm just going to start by giving a brief overview. So our first concept is embodiment. My claim is this: a human person is made up of the union of body and soul. Neither of these things by themselves is what makes you you. Rather, it's the combination of your specific body and your specific soul that makes you who you are. I think on some level that we all sense that our bodies and our souls, or you can think of it as our mind or our spirit, the immaterial part of you, that they're intertwined in some mysterious way. The problem is many of our most entrenched social practices, scripts, and institutions, not to mention the technologies at our disposal, train us to act as if our bodies and ourselves were two different things. Now, this is not a new problem. The basic idea that the mind is separable from the body and that your immaterial soul is the real you and your material body is somehow not, has kept cropping up in various forms throughout human history. And it remains very, very common today. Today, we all intuitively tend to think of our bodies as things that we own. Like any other kind of property, the body is seen as something that we are free to use, to rent, to sell, or to modify at will. I think part of the problem is that we spend so much of our lives on our smartphones. It's not just that scrolling through Instagram makes us objectify other people or judge them based on their digitally altered appearances, or that it makes us think that we can have real relationships with influencers or other people who we've never actually met in person. It's also, as Marianna mentioned, that it trains us to begin to turn that same lens, that commodifying, objectifying lens, upon ourselves. We begin to assess ourselves in terms of the way that we can be digitally represented as a product online. And we start to treat ourselves as something meant for other people's consumption. The young British author Freya India has a new book that's going to be coming out in a couple weeks that analyzes the way this process plays itself out in the lives of young women in particular. It's called Girls, Generation Z and the Commodification of Everything. She argues that in the modern world, corporations magnify the age-old anxieties that young women have always experienced in order to ruthlessly exploit and profit from them. As she puts it, corporations capitalize on our fears and vulnerabilities to constantly sell us products and services. This plays out in lots of different ways, through a lot of different apps, from Instagram and TikTok to Facetune and Hinge, Bumble, Tinder. More broadly, when we're attached to our phones, whatever app we're using, even though we might be obsessing over the appearance or the image of bodies, we tend to actually tune out the actual experience of living and in and being a body, right? We get sucked into the trap of doom scrolling in search of ever more dopamine hits. And we ignore the quieter cues of our bodies, our needs for things like physical movement or adequate sleep. The truth that we need to reclaim is that our bodies and our souls affect one another. If we want to live good lives and build healthy romantic relationships, we need to tend to and value them both. Human beings are unique among the animals in our capacity for rationality. We also have the imaginative capability for sympathy and empathy. In other words, we can, with greater or lesser accuracy, imagine ourselves in someone else's shoes. These are functions of the immaterial part of you, whether you want to call that your mind, your consciousness, or your soul. But this capacity to think and to feel and to love and to imagine and to empathize is also made possible by your physical body. Not just the neurotransmitters and neurons in your brain, but also by your eyes and your ears, which take in the information that you process, and by countless other parts of your body. New research on depression, for example, is revealing that your microbiome plays a much larger and more significant role in your emotional life than anyone had previously imagined. You can see the effects of your body on your mind if you stop and pay attention to how your thought processes and feelings change in response to different physical stimuli. If you like to work out, for example, you might be familiar with the effect of endorphins, that runner's high. So that process starts when you make the rational decision that you should work out. You know it's good for you, right? And then you make an act of the will to say, I'm going to get up and I'm going to do this. You start. You feel the discomfort in your lungs. You feel the fatigue in your legs. But you choose to keep going. You continue to move your legs. And at a certain point, your brain responds to that stimuli, the continued exertion of your body, by releasing a flood of endorphins, which create the subjective experience of exhilaration. You feel powerful and strong, like you could keep going forever. And even though your muscles are still experiencing that buildup of lactic acid that creates fatigue, you're suddenly able to put on a burst of speed. Not only that, the sprint suddenly magically feels easy. And that feeling carries over long after you're done running. For hours or even days afterwards, you're going to feel more confident, more energetic, and more optimistic than you would have if you hadn't gone for that run. That's why exercise is one of the most potent first-line treatments for depression. And countless studies show increased cognitive capacities after even small amounts of exercise. So I said earlier that I think it's a mistake to discount the body and to think of our minds or our souls as our real selves. I also think it's a mistake to take the opposite approach, the purely materialistic approach that looks at that example and says, well, we're all just a product of our endorphins or the neurotransmitters in our brain, the chemical processes in our bodies, that consciousness and individual identity and free will are all illusions. Remember, in our example, that the act of going for a run didn't originate in my muscles. It originated in my rational assessment that it would be good for me to exercise, and the voluntary choice of my will to carry out that judgment by actually doing it. So there's an interplay that goes on there between the immaterial part of you and the material part of you. It's a constant feedback loop. So our bodies and our souls are both essential parts of who we are, and we need to resist the temptation to overemphasize or to discount either one. Okay, so that's a quick look at what I mean by embodiment. Now I'm going to turn to our second concept, which is interdependence. So as Dr. Orlandi said, Aristotle famously described man as a social animal. That means we're naturally drawn to one another, and we need relationships with other people in order to become who we were meant to be. This is true whether we admit it or not. But we live in a culture that idolizes autonomy and independence. The fact is, we all came into being as radically dependent babies. None of us would be here today if we didn't receive years and years of self-sacrificial care from the adults in our lives, who fed us and clothed us and kept us from sticking our fingers into electrical sockets or running out into traffic. I have a 3-year-old. I can tell you it's a lot of work to keep a little person alive. Physically speaking, college students are in the prime of your lives. I don't know the specific details of any of your health statuses, but as a group, you are the healthiest and most independent you're ever going to be. So, especially because we live in a culture that tells us that freedom and independence is the goal, it's easy to think that keeping your options open and not depending on anybody is the best way to live. You're healthy enough and strong enough that you can keep up that illusion of radical autonomy right now. But I'm here to tell you that it's not true. The fact is, human beings need each other, and they also need to be needed by each other. After a while, pursuing money or pleasure or status will start to get old. It's not that any of those things are bad or unimportant, but it's that they are ultimately less important than relationships. There's a program at Harvard University's Institute for Quantitative Social Science. It's called the Human Flourishing Project. And they have amassed a gigantic data set with over 200,000 people from 22 different countries around the world. They analyzed that huge pool of data to find what kind of actions and attributes were associated with well-being or flourishing. And they define that as a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. So these researchers found that, as the old saying goes, money cannot buy happiness. Wealth was not correlated with greater flourishing. But what does lead to flourishing is investment in deep, meaningful relationships, especially through marriage and family life, and active participation in a religious community. So I would encourage you not to fear depending on others by being vulnerable with them and showing them that you need their love and support. You should also seek out opportunities to provide that kind of support to other people. This is a skill that will help you to forge a successful romantic relationship whenever you're ready to embark on one. And you can start practicing it here and now, even if you haven't met your soulmate yet. In particular, I would encourage you to seek out relationships with people who are in different stages of life than you are. When you're living on a college campus, you're surrounded by other people who are also in that independent, young, late teens, early 20s, that stage of life. And that's a great opportunity to find people who might be a good life partner, but it can also train you to look at the world in a kind of unnatural way, to forget the realities of the rest of what your life is going to look like. So call your grandparents. Offer to babysit your nieces or nephews if you have them. If you're far away from family, you can look for local opportunities to interact in person with little kids, with young parents, with elderly people. Because you have so much freedom and physical strength, there are lots of little things you can do for them that really make a difference in their lives. And in return, I think that you are going to find that your life is enriched by the opportunity to learn from them and to see the world from their perspective. In the process, you'll be able to practice being the kind of person that other people can count on, and who's brave enough to ask for help and guidance when you need it too. If you do want to get married someday, those skills and character traits are going to serve you well. Okay, on to our last topic, that's sexual difference. This is a complex one, and I'm only going to be able to scratch the surface here, so I'm happy to, again, dive into it more later. But I think that a correct understanding of sexual difference has to be based upon the two ideas that we've just discussed, embodiment and interdependence. If we really understand that our bodies are an essential part of who we are as persons, and we know that those bodies are either male or female, then it makes sense that our sex would influence our identities. At the most basic level, as Aristotle put it, males reproduce outside of their bodies, and females reproduce inside of their bodies. Whether or not we actually personally have children, our bodies are oriented toward one of those two ways of reproducing. Now, for women, bearing children has a lot higher cost than it does for men. I can tell you from experience that getting pregnant transforms your body and your brain. You suddenly find yourself living not only for yourself, but for this totally new person who is utterly dependent on you. Whether you like it or not, once you get pregnant, if you do not intervene to stop this process, your body will nourish that baby and give it a safe place to grow. You're going to have to give birth to that baby. And throughout birth, the postpartum period, and early motherhood, that baby is going to be viscerally connected to and dependent upon you and your specific body. Men experience all of this at a step removed. Unlike women after conception, they can walk away, right? They have to actively choose to stick around and care for the child and the mother of their child. Because the baby is so vulnerable and dependent, this also makes the mother vulnerable and dependent, at least for a period of time. And that vulnerability is an invitation for men to step up, to provide the love and the care and the physical and emotional support and protection that that mother and that baby need. I mentioned the feminist movement earlier in this talk, and I want to be clear here. I do consider myself a feminist, a sex realist feminist. So sexual difference does not entail sexual hierarchy. The two sexes are physically different, but they are each equally human. They're equally rational and intelligent and competent and deserving of equal protection under the law. Again, I'm incredibly grateful for the advances of both the first and the second wave of feminism. But one area where, especially since the second wave, the mainstream feminist movement has gone off course is in terms of philosophical anthropology. I think that many feminists devalue the body, and particularly the female fertile body, and have tried to deny the fundamental human reality of interdependence. They've seen abortion and birth control and sexual liberation as ways of trying to help women achieve this unrealistic ideal of the unsexed, independent, self-determining, totally autonomous individual. But that's not what either men or women were ever meant to be. And chasing after that false vision of the good life has not led to happiness or empowerment. It's led to loneliness and isolation. So the topic of this conference is romance and marriage, and I'm really looking forward to talking more in our conversation about how sexual difference plays out in real life and how we can form healthier social scripts in our current social context. But in concrete terms, the challenge I'm going to leave you with today is more foundational than asking somebody out on a date. Ultimately, what I'm asking you to do is to reclaim your humanity. I'm asking you to remember that you are embodied and interdependent men and women, and that all of those parts of your identity are good and should be honored. So when we finish here today, I hope that you will put down your smartphone and go for a walk, make eye contact with a stranger and say hello, even if it feels awkward. I hope you'll go out for coffee with a friend and actually share what you're struggling with or excited about and encourage them to share too. I hope you'll remember that the little choices that you make every day help to shape your character and the norms of your social circle in ways that can help us all to become more authentically human. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Serena. I was expecting a great talk, and that was a great talk. And we do have a podcast at the Austin Institute, so I think that I'm gonna get you to promise we're recording that you're gonna be on the podcast maybe right before you publish your book, so that we get the fame with you. There's a lot to talk about what you said. You said we can ask a million questions, and there will be some time for questions from the public. But I did the Q&A will be led, this one by me and the next one by Professor Regnerus. So I wanted to start with this. You did mention embodiment, relationality, and sexual difference. So on the sexual difference part, this is something I can take from a recent fact that happened, in this case to Dr. Ruiz. We were discussing the other day of how at the gym, personal trainers and coaches do not have different programs for women. Yeah. Right? So you go to a gym and you ask them, to have a personalized plan. Mm-hmm. But the way they're going to train the body of a woman is exactly the same of the way they're going to train the body of the man. So the question here was, you do mention you're a sex realist feminist, and you did mention that you wouldn't give up some of the advantages and the rights and the things that women have conquered. But so, did we conquer really anything if then at the gym, our shoulders are treated the same ways that men's shoulders are treated? And yeah,
I mean,
which is a broader question, of course, but I know I don't need to tell you that.
Let's see, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, so I would say yes and no, right? I think the feminist revolution is an unfinished one, and I think that what I call sex surrealism, this false idea that sexuality, our physical bodies don't matter, and that we can kind of try to aim for this ideal of the autonomous, unsexed person, has been really good in certain quantifiable ways for women, right? Again, Patrick Brown's going to talk about the economics that have happened. So women are a lot more economically dependent, all of these things. Women are killing it, guys. That's actually part of the problem with relationship formation, is that women are doing really, really well in education and employment, and men are increasingly falling behind. And so women see less of a reason to settle down, right? But I think in terms of our own relationships with our bodies, we are not doing so great. And I think one of the main problems and main reasons is that we have exalted the pill as a major driver of women's progress. And again, empirically speaking, it has been. Being able to control your fertility and to not get pregnant when you don't mean to allows you to do so much more, because being pregnant does make certain things more difficult. But when you look at the statistics of, I think it's 85% of women by the time they reach 40 have been on hormonal contraception. Huge numbers of women are put on hormonal contraception when they're teens, even though studies show that there are much higher risks for things like depression and suicide for young people when they're put on the pill, and they stay on it for years and years. So they never actually get to know what it feels like to naturally cycle. And as someone who has been tracking my fertility for almost 2 decades now, you start to actually notice, again, the way that your body and your mind are so intertwined. And you feel, you see it, I'm a runner, right? Like, and you see, like, when you're around ovulation and you've got that surge of the follicle stimulating hormone and the estrogen in particular, like, you are so strong. And so your performance is great. Like, if you can time your races around ovulation, do it. Like, when you're PMSing, when you're on the first couple of days of your period, like, your performance is not going to be the same. And in early pregnancy, relaxin, these hormones change the way you add muscle to your body, the ligaments in your body. So I think there's a growing awareness, even among more mainstream feminists, that we really have done women a disservice by shutting down their bodies or teaching them to do that in order to be empowered. And we're starting to kind of demand more actual scientific research into women's fertility. I'm sorry, this is like a passion point of mine, so I can keep talking.
Please.
Because we have, even in scientific research trials, for decades, NIH, all of the different government funding, most of the studies that happen require women to be on the birth control pill. So the vast majority, and you can see why they do that, right? Like, they don't want to expose babies to untested medications. And also, it's a lot more difficult if you're trying to track a huge number of women's menstrual cycles and to, like, see how it affects women at all those different stages. That's extremely time consuming. You have to have a really large sample. There's a lot of, like, just methodological constraints that make it really hard. But the end result of that is that women are being prescribed medication that has never ever been tested on a naturally cycling woman. And they're often being doses that are, giving doses that are corroborated or calibrated to a man's body, which is on average much larger. So they're often being overdosed, having worse side effects, and then being dismissed when they go to the doctor and complain about those side effects and being told that it's all in their head. So anyway, so to me, this is a feminist issue, and I do think that the trainers at the gym should be tweaking your workout regimen to take into account where you are in your cycle.
Yeah. Thank you, Serena. I can't wait to read your book, because I'm pretty sure there's going to be some of this. But, another thought that I had the other day is, like, everyone talks a lot about the cortisol levels.
Yeah.
But I was reading that only now some of the researchers realize that they should probably test it in women at the different stages of but no one body has been thinking in terms of cycles for women, right, because they've been so sterilized for a while. Anyway, thank you. That was the first one. Second, and I think it's close, but you can choose which way you want to go with this one. So it's a thought about if there are these differences, right? Equality of opportunities would mean different opportunities for men and women, probably in some scenarios, right? So different settings, different ways in which you can get to the same results, right? So one could think, in the workplace, should there be different arrangements for men and women, like, so different schedules, different ways of approaching the work? That's one way where, if you want to talk about that, that could be one way. The one thing I thought is, because we have students here, and because you've been a mother relatively young, at least young compared to today's standards, right? When you're 45 and you have a baby, that's normal. Are there one or two things that you think could change at the college level or the grad schools level that would help the kind of culture that you were envisioning and you were describing, right? One where we reclaim our humanity, but we also start thinking more seriously about our relationality and our need for the other.
Okay, there's a lot there.
Yeah, pick one.
Yeah, on the questions of equality of opportunity, I do think that one kind of bad approach, I think, that has been common in a lot of what's often derided as, like, girl boss feminism, is, like, looking for equality of outcomes and kind of obsessively focusing on things like the gender pay gap. Because if you drill down into the data, a lot of the gender pay gap is actually a motherhood pay gap. And it's often a function of women choosing to work less once they have kids and to choose more flexible careers, which are less financially remunerative, right? So part of the problem is that, like, I don't think I don't think that perfect 50-50 equality throughout every stage of a woman's life is what we should be aiming for. I do wish that kind of just imaginatively, as you're a young person thinking about your life, that there were more roadmaps for you. Because I think that we have kind of absorbed, there's something called the ideal worker model, right? That we're all supposed to be kind of just perfect. Our work is like the main thing in our lives. We don't have these like inconvenient family things that will take us away. And we're going to have a career progression that's just up, up, up. And then once we get in our 30s or 40s and we're financially stable, we've got the corner office, whatever, then we can have kids. And that works like kind of okay for men. I think it hurts them in some ways too, but it works better with their biology than it does for women's biology, because women are most fertile in their 20s and become less so as they age, and pregnancy does get harder as you get older. You have more risk of different complications. So I really wish that we could see more life paths and that there were more concrete ways of kind of leaning in and out, because if you have kids when you're a little younger, it's easier on you physically, but you take a bigger career hit, and then it can be really hard to get back into the workplace if you do step off. And so there are some interesting like corporations that have like on-ramp programs for stay-at-home moms to come back. And I do think that, especially post-COVID, there's been an increase in flexible remote jobs, which is what I've done. You know, I working at the Witherspoon Institute when I had my first two children, I was able to work almost all remotely, just going like one day a week when I had a friend watch my baby. I had, I scaled down to part-time, and I found like little homeschool girls to come and like play with my baby while I would work. You know, so it was really nice because you can actually like spend physical time with your baby, but not totally give up your intellectual life or your career progression. And so I think just even knowing as a young woman that kind of stuff is on the table, that you don't have to choose this really stark, like, am I going to have a career and a fulfilling intellectual life, or am I going to be a suburban stay-at-home mom and like whatever, you know, like this, it doesn't have to be one or the other. But I think there are concrete things, you know, Princeton, my husband was a grad student at Princeton when we got married and started having kids, and they actually were really good about, and Witherspoon was also really good about giving me paid maternity leave, Princeton had like childcare, like they funded my mother's helpers, you know, like they gave childcare and flexible enough childcare that I didn't have to put my baby in a full-time daycare center in order to get those financial benefits. So programs like that, and also just professors bringing their kids on campus, just seeing more ways of integrating work and family life, I think can help young people imagine ways of living that integrate the two and prioritize family life earlier in your life.
Thank you. And I do want to say to the audience that the magazine you now are a co-editor of, Fair Disputation, has a lot of articles where I think we can see how these different paths go, and like different women have contributed talking about that a bit. So one thing, more broadly speaking, when you talk about feminism and you consider yourself a feminism, and now we all know that the word has given a really bad, reputation. For some, it's the best word, and for some, it's the worst ever. So, if you could say, when and how did things start to get wrong, if you want to call it wrong, with the frame that you gave us?
Yeah. So, I think. So there's always been kind of tension within the feminist movement from the first wave. There have been more explicitly Christian reformers who were very focused on maternity, who wanted women to have rights so that they could be better mothers, so that they could be educated, and they could educate their children well. Like even kind of the first proto-feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft, really looks at family life as being good and ennobling, but that also women need to be able to be legal persons after their marriage, for example. And so in the first wave, there was a tension between kind of more maternalists and women who were more focused on autonomy. So like even women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton is one who sort of talks about, just a famous speech talking about kind of being an island, right? Like it's this idea of like everyone, we are each individual persons, and we need to be able to choose freely. And that sort of emphasis on choice, I think, especially beginning with Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex in 1949, and she kind of kicked off second wave feminism. So she was coming from an existentialist framework where really you construct your identity through your choices, and she was very, very negative about women's bodies and fertility, and saw motherhood and slavery as slavery to the species, that was keeping women from becoming full human persons. So Betty Friedan read The Second Sex in the 1950s, and then she has some great quotes where she read it and she said she was so depressed she couldn't get out of bed for a week. But finally she was able to kind of metabolize that existentialism and say, you know what, like the experience of the post-war American housewife where we're just all like, in our houses, this is something that can be changed. And so she kind of, so she was a suburban housewife who had gone to an elite university. So she was one of the first generations to have access to elite education as a woman. And she then kind of looked and surveyed a bunch of her classmates, saw how they had gotten these amazing educations, but then, and many of them during the Second World War, while the men were off fighting, like had jobs. But then after the war, when everybody came home, there was this emphasis on having babies and all, and so they gave up their jobs. And then as their kids went to school, they were sort of, they felt, and as we had all these technological advances with the washing machine and all of these things, like even the physical work of taking care of a home, like took less time. So there was a lot of boredom. So she then wrote this, the 1963 bestseller, The Feminine Mystique, which was it was bestseller is an understatement, and it so resonated with women that a lot of people credit her with single-handedly kicking off the second wave feminist movement. So then it was in the late 1960s, as she formed a national organization for women, that then it started out as trying to gain educational and employment opportunities for women and fighting for the actual enforcement of the Civil Rights Act, which was supposed to outlaw discrimination based on sex, but wasn't being enforced. So they had some great cases, like with the airline stewardess who would be fired if they got pregnant or gained 10 pounds or different things. But then, especially in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the sexual revolution kind of became intertwined with the women's movement. And I think that's where things really got off track. And enshrining kind of abortion and choice in particular. There's sort of this like ethics-free choice that like freedom and the ability to choose whatever you want and keeping your options open. Again, that kind of idol of radical autonomy became the driving factor behind liberal feminism. And I think that's where we went wrong. Yeah, and trying to imitate men and having that freedom both sexually and in the workplace, and that's how we should achieve equality.
All right. Well, I'm very satisfied by this answer. So I think that now there is time for 2, maybe 3 questions, depending on how much they will take for you to answer.
I'll try not to talk too much.
Dr. Alessandro there, our intern has the mic, so if you want to raise your hand if anyone has questions.
Do you have any ideas about approaching education with sex differences in mind?
At a particular level, like?
All of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have 3 girls, and they're 10 and under. So it's interesting because you definitely do see sex differences among kids, and I think boys I think have been ill-served in a lot of ways in our current educational institutions. There's a lot of interesting research out there because, so like there's a policy researcher named Richard Reeves, who has this book called Of Boys and Men, looking at the ways that men are really not doing well. And one of the big factors is education, I think, because in the public school system, there is an emphasis on seat work, on like sitting down and being quiet, and boys tend to struggle with that more. One of his recommendations is redshirting boys and holding them back a year, because their impulse control tends to be about a year behind girls, and they tend to need more physical movement. Girls, it's good for girls to have physical movement too, but they can kind of get by with less recess. There's been less recess, again, more emphasis on seat work, and also elementary school and middle school teachers are overwhelmingly women, partially because they're not paid well, and men often need to be able to support a family. There's a lot there, but there's some really interesting research on how much better boys do when they actually do have a male teacher. So I think getting men into education and increasing their pay, if we can't, that would help boys a lot, and not pathologizing the fidgetiness or the like need for physical movement, I think would help boys a lot. I think we've made a lot of strides with women and things like STEM, and sometimes single-sex education can be good for that, because especially as you reach puberty, a lot of times girls will like hold themselves back so that they don't try, intimidate the boys or various, but I think there have been a lot of good initiatives to help women in STEM, but we have kind of this funny unisex model that doesn't really serve boys well when they're young, and then I think doesn't necessarily help women, like they excel at it, but then it doesn't really set them up for thinking through what careers would actually be helpful if they want to have family life at a younger age. So I think I don't know, those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Joe?
Thanks. You talked about how we gain social status by going towards career or moving away, and it seems like there's all these pursuits that are against marriage, against having kids. So in a society, and I want to foreground that I think that's a biological need, is to get praise from our peers and to like fit into society. So for those of us where that's the society to live in, how do we then operate and go towards those pursuits? Because I think it's easy to say, well, just go against society, but how do you do that?
I think you need to form an alternative society, right? Like, I think, and I see this as a parent with my kids too, and choosing like what school I'm sending them to or different things. Like, who are your peers? Like, who are you trying to gain status in their eyes? And so finding other people, and there's a lot of drawbacks to the internet, but one way I think it can be helpful is by initially helping you find other people who have the same goals as you, and then if you can take that leap to bring it to in-person community. So if you're in a large area like Austin, it might be hard for you to connect with the other people who actually care about those things, but either through organizations like this, through religious communities, through whatever kind of networks you can find, and institutions, I think that you need to either find them or make them and connect with other people, kind of finding durable ways of relating to one another and building that peer group who you all like kind of care about the same things. You want to build a meaningful life together, and they're going to like actually think it's amazing that you're committing and getting married and having a baby, and they're going to bring you the casserole, and they're going to, like, you need to find that, because you are a social animal, and you're right, like you do care what other people think of you, but you have to decide whose opinions you care about. And build that community around yourself.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, as you mentioned, just go to the Austin Institute professionals events, and that usually helps. There, that table. It's gonna be the last question.
So like, do you have any ideas on like how to like approach gender differences in healthcare, like as a provider, since the research like doesn't favor women's bodies, like how we can affect that, like given like there's downstream costs to that and we can't really change it upstream if you're a provider, not a researcher?
Yeah. Can I ask, are you a provider, or you're thinking through like as if you're like a nurse working with Selma or a doctor?
I'm an EMT,
Yeah.
but I'm also
Okay.
looking to like become a doctor in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so my impression, I am not a doctor, but my mom is a doctor and I have a lot of friends who are, and my impression is that a lot of the education is really substandard in regards to women's fertility. So I think even just taking the time to educate yourself on that, there's a lot of great resources out there. I mean, kind of the classic is a book called Taking Charge of Your Fertility, but there is research out there if you seek it out about understanding the functions of women's bodies. And I think there's a growing awareness. There's a woman named Sarah Hill who's written a great book called Your Brain on Birth Control. And she had a new one, I'm trying to remember, I forget her latest book's name, but it's more broadly about women's cycles and how it affects them. So I think there's more there if you seek it out. But I think even just an awareness of the fact that where your patient is in her cycle will affect everything, and helping her become more aware of that too is helpful. And looking for root causes if someone is coming in with a complaint, because I think the standard of care for most reproductive issues is hormonal contraception. If you come in with acne or with any kind of pain, and women really, especially, so PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and endometriosis, those are kind of two of the biggest problems that women face. And endometriosis, the average time it takes for a woman to get a diagnosis from the time she first goes to the doctor to an actual accurate diagnosis is 10 years. So like, women are not being listened to, they're being handed a Band-Aid, and then they're suffering, and they have to keep following up and fighting. And there's starting to be a little more movement on actually treating endometriosis, which is really tricky and it's not well understood. It's where uterine tissue grows outside of your uterus, basically. So it can be really painful. It can be anywhere throughout your body. It can be really debilitating at certain times of the month. And the treatments for it, there's some surgical treatments to remove the tissue, which is the best. But anyway, it's also an autoimmune disease. It's very poorly understood. It's very complex in the body. So that's one thing that I'm really hoping that we'll get. I have my critiques of the MAHA movement, but there is some interesting stuff going on there with looking at restorative reproductive medicine. So anyway, just not giving your patients a Band-Aid, listening to them, really taking it a step further to try to figure out what's going on and trying to connect them with the providers who can actually investigate and provide solutions rather than just trying to deal with the symptoms would be probably my biggest piece of advice or hope for providers. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, Serena. This was the last question for today, but then there will be the questions for the panel. And so I think that if you help me thank Serena as our first speaker.
Thank you, Serena, for sharing your wisdom with all of us. In our second talk, we will hear from Patrick Brown. Patrick Brown is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where his work focuses on developing a robust pro-family economic agenda and supporting families as the cornerstone of a healthy and flourishing society. He is a husband and a father of 4 young children. One is actually here. His talk is titled, "Is Marriage a Luxury Good? Understanding the Shifting Economics of Family Life." Please help me welcome Dr. Brown.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Austin. My first time visiting this dynamism hub. I've been losing track of the Waymos I've seen outside the hotel and everything. It's quite a pleasure to be here and see what all the fuss is about. Even more pleasure to be here to talk about what's at the core of what I believe a healthy and functioning society is all about. We've heard from Serena about some of the more interpersonal dynamics, and we'll hear again from Dr. Breuninger at the end of the day about sort of the micro level decisions about family life and marriage and having kids and all the rest. But my job is to take us back up to about 30,000 feet to talk a little bit about the systemic structural changes that are going on that are leading to a path that is less optimistic and confident than maybe the culture here in Austin exemplifies. I would, if we look out at the newspaper headlines or TikTok videos or whatever your media consumption diet of choice, you'll know that birth rates are declining both here in the US as well as pretty much everywhere around the globe except for the sub-Saharan Africa. I think the easy explanation that you'll hear is, well, of course, how can you expect people to have kids and start a family when it's so expensive? People can't afford to have kids because childcare costs too much or student loan debt is too high. The cost of living keeps rising. You can kind of fill in your boogeyman here. The problem with that sort of affordability story is that it's not strictly true. It's not fully wrong for reasons we'll get into, but it's at best incomplete. I think the biggest reason why birth rates and marriage rates continue to fall is because we've put marriage on a pedestal while simultaneously making it less necessary. People don't need to get married anymore in the same way they did a half century ago. So that means that the institution of marriage, which is highly correlated with the decision to have a child, is now more about love, companionship, self-expression than it is about this kind of economic and material necessity. This leads to a situation where the bar at which you need to clear in order to be considered a good partner or a good parent or a potential spouse continues to rise. Not because of some grand conspiracy where the libs or the elites are trying to keep you down, but because we're simply getting wealthier as a society. As a result, our years of sort of prime family formation are directly in conflict with our years of prime human capital formation, whether that's here at UT Austin or getting a graduate school degree or embarking onto a career path. Looking for a corner office promotion, that sort of thing. We're on a path now where marriage and family life are increasingly diverging. They're becoming something that economists might call a luxury good, something that you attain more of as your income increases. Again, not because it's become more expensive out of pocket, but because of what it costs to forego in order to enter college life. For college-educated Americans, this model works okay, and we can get into the statistics. There is definitely room to improve along the edges, but college-educated Americans still get married at pretty high clips. Their fertility rate is pretty decent overall. It's among Americans without a college degree that we're seeing the sharpest declines in both relationship formation to begin with, those relationships turning into marriage, and those marriages turning into a baby carriage, as it were. I think this spells disaster for our politics and for our economy. We can talk about the dystopian future that'll lead to. But first, to understand where we're going, of course, it always helps to understand where we're coming from. Through most of, really human history up until very recently, children were both an investment and an insurance policy. They were expected to contribute to the family, whether that was in the fields or in the factories. And as society got wealthier and as law and culture improved, I guess, we've decided to no longer have children working their fingers off in the factories. My 10-year-old is very grateful for that. We've now we've kind of removed the economic rationale for having children earlier in life. At the same time, we've subsidized, or socialized, I guess is a more precise word, the cost of old age. The New Deal, the Great Society, we introduced Social Security and Medicare, with the end result that now parents bear the cost of having children individually, but the benefits flow to the rest of society in the form of future job creators, entrepreneurs, AI code prompters, whatever they grow up to be. And again, we're sort of subsidizing the cost of old age while privatizing the expense of raising kids. This is an asymmetry that at the time of the the New Deal and the Great Society, this was not a problem because you had more workers per retiree and more children coming up along the way to sort of fill the ranks. As we've seen life expectancy grow, which is a good thing, more time with grandma, but also birth rates decline, now we have a problem where we have fewer kids coming up to sort of shoulder the burden of carrying on the social welfare scheme for the next generation. raising children has become more an act of consumption than one of production. And so it should be not a huge surprise, that more and more people are opting out. Again, you see this in the sort of influencer videos. How can we expect to have kids in this economy? How can we afford it? So let's unpack this a little bit. I'll preface this by saying I think they're right about one thing. I think the cost of housing, you can look at the data, you can look at people doing this research in a very careful way. The cost of housing is directly related to your likelihood of forming a family. As the price of housing goes up, people who own a home feel more confident, they're more likely to have kids. But in a world in which we sort of rely on high and persistently rising housing prices that freeze out younger couples, people in their 20s from getting on the housing ladder in the first place, we're sort of rewarding people who are maybe empty nesters or past their years of prime childbearing, and the people who are earlier on the ladder, who often are renting or trying to scrape together that down payment, feel poorer. And they are more likely to kind of hunker down and say, I just don't feel ready right now. So as a whole, when you look at especially expensive real estate markets, California, other places like that, when you see rising home prices, you see a direct correlation with marriage rates, fertility rates, household formation falling. Now, I don't need to tell those of you here in Austin that supply and demand still works. And you guys are one of the sort of foremost examples of what happens when you have cranes all around downtown and building apartments, keeping rents from skyrocketing the same way they have across the country. That's a very hopeful story, that's a story that other localities and states should learn from. But overall, across the rest of America, this sort of reliance on the vested interests of homeowners rather than those who are looking to own a home does have a direct impact on family formation. So that, I think, is a sort of one critical point for the it's too expensive to raise a family crowd. So you have to be sort of YIMBY, yes in my backyard, if you want to be pro-family, in my opinion. But then you look at the other sort of commonly cited factors of household affordability, and when researchers look at this, and you can go across the board, everything you can think of, childcare costs, student loan debt, Medicare access, abortion access, anything you can kind of think of where here's the link between why it feels so expensive to raise a family. There's just no smoking gun, and it's a very flat relationship, not just here in the U.S., but when you look across the world as well. Scandinavian countries have some of the most generous social safety net programs available. Their birth rates have plunged. Japan, South Korea, France, anywhere that's tried to sort of throw money at the problem. Hungary, most recently, that's kind of a famous example. They've also not been able to really sustain any sort of birth rate growth. It all continues to slide downhill. And that's because I think the best way of understanding the cost of childbearing is not about the out-of-pocket costs themselves, but what you have to give up in order to have a kid. The implicit price, the opportunity cost of raising a child. And that only goes up as society gets wealthier. If you're a school teacher in Des Moines, Iowa in 1920 or something, the wages that you give up in order to drop out of the labor force and raise a family, that's not a huge hit to your family's income. What you were going to spend on that, you're kind of constrained in terms of what your opportunities to consume. You weren't going to fly to Europe or buy a big screen TV or something. And as the world gets wealthier, as you have these more educational opportunities, professional opportunities, consumption opportunities, that's what you have to give up in order to have a kid. At the same time, we've sort of, and people argue, is this cause or effect? It's probably a little bit of both. Parenting itself has become more labor intensive, where back in the 60s, you could kind of open the door and have them run around and just say, come home by the time we start dinner. Now, economists have started calling this the rug rat race, where every act of parenthood is a verb. Parenting is now like something you're actively doing to cultivate human capital so they can get into Harvard, and if you don't get in the right preschool, you're screwed, right? This is good in some regard. We want kids to succeed. It's good to have test scores and all the rest, but it is entirely possible to have too much of a good thing. And so as that ratchet continues to rise, that bar of what you have to do, the sort of minimum acceptable level of being considered a good parent continues to rise, then it's no wonder that some people kind of opt out and say, I don't want to have to put that much of my emotional energy to become the Sherpa and chauffeur and college admissions counselor for a hypothetical child. You just can't raise a child, in most parts of America on a 1960s diet of Tang and peanut butter sandwiches, the hands-off parenting style, 1960s car seats and safety standards. You'll get CPS called on you pretty quick. And there's benefits to that. We're a safer country. Child mortality is much lower today than it ever was. We're a wealthier society, so we can afford a lot of these, travel ball for middle schoolers and that sort of thing. But it just raises the baseline of what's considered normal, what you have to pay in terms of emotional investment and your own personal capital in order to become a parent. And so I think that's especially true for the sort of margin of people who are on the college track. It's a different story when we think about decomposing this into, again, college Americans and Americans without a college degree. And this is not meant to be pejorative at all. It's just these are kind of two groups of people that we can kind of easily distinguish. And so here we can think about the decline in fertility that so much attention has been paid to. Thinking back to 2007, which was perhaps not coincidentally the year the iPhone was invented, that was the year we hit peak baby in America. We had about 4.3 million births in 2007. We're down to about 3.6 million last year. So it's a substantial decrease, and it's been across the board, heavily concentrated among Black and Hispanic women, younger women, teens, women in their 20s. We're seeing a little bit of an uptick in women by the time they're in their 30s or even 40s, but not enough to counterbalance the decline earlier in life. I think the most interesting story, though, is that if you look at married fertility versus non-married fertility, women who are married are still pretty much in the historic range they've been for the last couple of decades. They have not seen much of a drop at all. The big driver of declining fertility here in the US and in Europe as well is the decline in marriage. Unmarried women's fertility has dropped about 30% over the last roughly 2 decades, since 2007. And it's been much smaller, about 7 or 8% for married women. And so if you want to understand why people aren't having kids, you have to understand, as we've been hearing about, as we'll be talking about, why they're not getting married in the first place. And that's where the story of sort of intentionality comes in, and these different tracks that college and non-college Americans are doing. I think one way of understanding this is to see that and this I'm kind of cribbing from a book called Career and Family by the Nobel Prize winning economist Claudia Golden. She argues that for college-educated women who are sort of on that upward trajectory of getting a degree, trying to balance, trying to have it all that sort of stuff, they had their gender revolution in the 70s and 80s and have largely come through on the other side. Married women today aren't having as many babies as their grandma did, but they're roughly about as many as their mom did. And so, for all the debates about, are women in the workforce, to blame and all this sort of stuff, it's really just not true that's where we're seeing a big shift. What we're seeing is that now lower income women without a college degree, who have a high school diploma or maybe some college, they're now sort of, instead of having kids early in life the way that they did in the 70s, 80s, 90s, now they're sort of modeling the same behaviors that college-educated women have for a couple decades. So they're waiting until they find someone who they feel ready is worth settling down with. And I think this was not true. If you read the sort of literature of single parenthood, Kathy Eden, famous book on this in the early 2000s, there was a sense that, at least, for moms who were sort of lower on the income spectrum, I might not have a stable relationship, but I can have a baby, and that's something that I can have my life to be about. That's a promise I can keep, to use the title of that book. That's not as true anymore. And so people kind of walking around with this mentality of single motherhood continues to rise, that hasn't been true since 2007. I think the right way to think about this is that people have a higher bar for marriage as an institution and for themselves and for their potential partner. That thought of what this guy who I might be in a relationship with or I might not be has to be able to meet in order to want to settle down and have kids together, because we're being more intentional maybe than we were in previous generations. That bar continues to rise, again, for some of the same reasons, right? The rising wage growth, rising consumption opportunities. Let me just give you a couple statistics to give you a sense of how dramatic this shift has been. So when your grandparents are, roughly were getting married in the 1970s, average age of first marriage for men was 23. Now it's 31. For women, it was 21 in the 70s, and last year was around 29 and a half. In demographic terms, that's pretty much a revolution over the course of a couple generations. I think one way of understanding that is that the things that used to be exclusive to married life are no longer. We've sort of unbundled the package of goods and services that we used to kind of reserve for walking down the aisle. Now you can get them pretty much wherever you want. If you wanted a reliable partner for sex, someone to have kids with, the economies of scale that came from pooling income and sharing resources and expenses, wanted to have someone there when you got old and share those burdens together. Obviously, even there's kind of a social status that went along with being married. If you read like a Jane Austen novel or really any literature from prior to the sexual revolution, there was a sort of suspicion of single men and what they were up to. If you wanted to kind of overcome that, you had to have the status of being married. Now that's no longer true, very clearly. There's not much of a stigma at all if you're not married, even if you're having kids and all the rest. It's in some respects easier to go out on 6th Street and live it up without any responsibilities getting in the way on the home front. You don't need, with no-fault divorce enters the picture. You're no longer committing to someone to be together forever. Married couples have no sort of unique economic advantage when cohabitation enters the picture. And if you want someone to have sex with, there's an app for that. So there's not as much of a exclusive material gain, if you want to be reductionist about it, from entering marriage. It becomes more about, again, affection, love, self-expression. These are all wonderful things, but people, when you lose that sort of normative vision of what marriage is, it just becomes one path among many. You're no longer marrying to, have these benefits or preserve the royal bloodline or whatever people used to do to get married. Now it's become essentially an institution of voluntary affection, just one path you can choose if you want to. And so it's harder if you're trying to cast that to find that path to yourself earlier in life. I think Andrew Cherlin, the sociologist from Johns Hopkins University, has termed this shift that we're talking about here, the change from the cornerstone model of marriage to the capstone model of marriage, where it used to be, high school sweethearts or ring by spring college grads getting married would sort of, face their 20s together, they're embarking on life. Now marriage is something closer to a graduation ceremony from young adulthood. You've finished that program, you've gotten that promotion, you've sown your wild oats, you're ready to settle down and get serious about starting a family. Again, I think that cornerstone model, that version of marriage where you're getting married in your early 20s, has a lot to recommend it, but it's also a higher variance strategy, to use sort of technical terminology. If you are in a world in which you're trying to sort of swim against the tide and fewer people are getting married earlier in life, you're taking a gamble that the person who you're marrying is going to become, you're going to grow together, right? That there is, that you're still embarking on this journey. You don't know who they're going to be. If you wait until you're in your early mid-30s to marry, well, you kind of know who you're going to be. You're set in your ways. That has its own set of problems, but it's less of a gamble, and you kind of know. And I think this is part of the reason why marriage has declined, and also divorce has declined, because people, they have fewer years for they're married, but also there's just a sense it's more predictable. There's less of a gamble that you're taking. And so when we've lost some of the material benefits that used to be exclusive to marriage, and more the people are waiting until later in life, this is it works, as we can kind of talk about. It works decently well, and there's pain points along the way for people who get college degrees, but this is particularly bad for people who are in that sort of lower economic strata, because if you're treating marriage as a graduation ceremony, but you never have the stability to feel like you are ready to be that person who's capable of giving themselves to the other, well, then you're just kind of in this holding pattern or gray zone. We're all very happy for Miss Swift and her future husband, Mr. Kelsey. Glad they're tying the knot sometime this year, reportedly. But her previous relationship, for the Swifties out there, was a 7-year kind of situationship that didn't have any direction to it. I think this is not uncommon for people, especially again in this demographic that is not oriented towards marriage. There's not as much of a compelling reason to get married as there used to be. So, this class divide that I've been talking about shows up in the data. For women in their 40s, just to take them as a representative group, it used to be that if you were non-college educated, you had a much higher likelihood of ever being married than if you. I'm sorry, did I say back? Women who don't have a college degree used to be more likely to get married. Now they're less. It was about 80% of women 90% of college graduate women in their 40s in the 1980s were ever married. Today it's about 85%. So a little bit of a decline, not terrible. Back in the 70s, or in 1980, when if you were a woman without a bachelor's degree, almost everybody got married. It was like 95% plus of women without a bachelor's degree in 1980 had ever been married. Some were divorced, but they had at least walked down the aisle once. Now it's about 74% and dropping. Unless there's a huge surge of marriages of women in their late 30s, we're going to see that number continue to fall. And again, this is among women without a bachelor's degree. And so something is not working there. I would argue that the kind of incentives that used to compel marriage, we've talked about some of them, also obviously the advent of reliable birth control means that now there's no longer daddy with a shotgun providing his own kind of incentive to get married. The rising educational attainment, labor force participation, rising wages, all these sort of things mean that now women without a college degree have more what we might call bargaining power when it comes to a relationship. They want to marry still. We can see this in pretty much every public opinion survey. Desire for marriage remains very high, but they want to marry someone who's worth marrying. And that's where I think we have to unpack what can we be doing about sort of that helping men clear that bar of marriageability, not measured in economic terms. And I think sometimes we kind of hear the political conversation about wages and all the rest, and we can unpack that in the Q&A if we want to, but I think it's not about economics so much as social terms. What can they bring to the table? When you ask women, we've done surveys of the women in their 20s and 30s, what's the biggest challenge for you in the dating scene? It's not finding someone who has a paycheck and a pulse, it's finding someone who's interested in more than a casual hookup, right? Or meeting somebody who will treat me with kindness and appreciation, flowers on our anniversary, that kind of thing. That is where I think, I'm happily married. I'm glad to be out of the dating game. My free advice to all the men is that's just what is missing right now, is that sense of social, emotional, interpersonal skills that I think women now have the ability to be a little bit pickier on, where, again, our sort of hypothetical school teacher in Iowa in 1920, it was like the guys you went to high school with or whoever you met at the barn raising or the church dance was kind of your pool. Now that there's so many more options, you kind of have to be thinking about what's your comparative advantage. Or where can you distinguish yourself? And for so many young men, especially those below, what we might call median income, the picture is just not great. And if I was a young 20-something woman and I'm looking out there, I'm not sure I'd want to marry some of them either. 1 in 4 young men now use marijuana regularly. We every time you turn on a UT game, I'm sure you see the ads for sports betting. That continues to rise. Prediction markets, gambling, all the rest, weed, porn. These kind of things are sort of opiates and ways that kind of habituate a short-term thinking that I think are disastrous for anyone trying to form a serious relationship. Obviously, these are new, introductions, but this is a long-running trend. But they're not helping, and I think they're actively hurting the scripts that men need to kind of become viable marriage partners. Not that women don't have their own challenges or that college-educated men are immune. That's not, I'm not saying everything's rosy on the whole, but at least college-educated men, as we can see in the data, have largely pivoted into this world where interpersonal skills and sort of attentiveness and those sort of things seem to play a much larger role in the marriage conversation. College-educated dads do way more chores and childcare than they did in previous generations, and that's kind of helped. A more egalitarian model of marriage perhaps is more appealing to somebody who got a college degree, a master's degree. And so the right question isn't whether men today are as economically successful as their predecessors. I think, again, if you unpack the data, depending on how you adjust for inflation and all the rest, I think they're at least where they were, if not better off. It's still possible to support a family on a single income if you're willing to make sacrifices and opt out of the rug rat race and all the rest. But the question is, what can men bring to the table, not compared to their predecessors of yesteryear, but relative to what a single woman can achieve on her own. Marriage material requires more than just money because we've gotten wealthier as a society. And so until we're able to solve that problem, I'm quite worried that marriage is going to become increasingly this luxury good that we're talking about, that it's going to be reserved more for the wealthy and the well-to-do rather than the people who need it most, which is the people who are at the lower income end of the spectrum. It's a huge source of loneliness and frustration, the decline in marriage, not to mention the decline in childbearing that I mentioned earlier. A world in which the stability of marriage and the joy of parenthood and presence and partnership is reserved for those who have sort of capped their success sequence is not one that is a pathway towards a rosy political future or economics. Even for men themselves, the likelihood of deaths of despair, drug abuse, alcohol, that sort of thing, those are much higher if you remain single than if you get married. To those who have, more will be given to them might be a great prescription for our spiritual life, but it's not a recipe for a stable politics. So we need to get down to root causes. I think if you look at the political landscape and the conversation both here and abroad, there's a little bit of interest in making America and other countries more pro-family. We've seen talks about the child tax credit, other things like that. I support all of that. There's definitely room for more. But until we understand that it's not the out-of-pocket costs of childbearing and the economic fortunes of young men that are driving the marriage and birth rate decline, we're not going to get to the answers. I think, when the ship springs a leak, you need to have an all-hands-on-deck approach. This is not just, this little tax credit here will solve the problem. We need to be doing the long-haul work of thinking, what are the scripts, what are the relationships that are being formed to help young men and women become more marriageable. This is where I think the rather gimmicky pronatalism of some of our friends or enemies in Silicon Valley kind of leads us down the wrong path as well. Talking about artificial wombs and genetic screening for embryos and surrogacy and all the rest. That's trying to address birth rates, birth rates as just numbers on a spreadsheet. I don't think that's a good service for children who are born from those initiatives. It's also not going to be a solution for our civilizational dilemma of what to do about a nation that's unable to form the sort of basic unit of society, where families, it's treating kids more as instrumental goods in search of colonizing Mars or whatever it happens to be, rather than thinking about what is our politics oriented towards. And obviously, part and parcel with that is also a growing recognition that kids do better when they're raised with two parents around rather than one. We all know single moms out there who are doing tremendous heroic work trying to make ends meet and put food on the table, but it's just simple math that having another adult around reduces the burden on mom or dad and helps kids do better on all sorts of dimensions. Just focusing on pronatalism TM doesn't actually help you build committed relationships that help the whole family. The good news, I think, in some respects, is that we haven't begun to fight. It's not that we're losing. It's just that our politics has become so distracted with either lip service to boomers and their interests, the homeowners and all the rest, to not really have taken the work of building a pro-family politics seriously. Pro-family policies, we can talk about paid leave and childcare and all the rest, and those are fine, but it's really about a way of thinking about our political policy choices that puts these relationships, these institutions at the foremost, rather than treating individuals as just sort of autonomous individuals with no relationship to each other. When you build a school, you can make sure you include sidewalks and stroller and curb cuts to make sure that people can walk their kids to school, or you can have it, be car dependent and not thinking about those sort of trade-offs. When you build a park and you can have it be overrun by a civil disorder, or you can have it be well maintained and oriented toward the needs of parents and kids. Those are the kind of conversations that we need to be having if we want to make America pro-family. Obviously, we can talk about the housing shortage as well that Austin is so good at addressing. Even some of our technological shifts. In the wake of COVID, the rise of remote work led to a mini baby boom among white-collar women who no longer had to commute an hour a day to work or find a childcare that was just perfectly located between their office and their home. So even now, a couple years later, there's still a little bit of an uptick compared to where we would have been otherwise, where women who used to face a very sharp trade-off between maybe working 40 hours a week in an office and being at home, now can kind of mix and match a little easier. Those are the type of shifts that we need to have for people who are lucky enough to get married. But on the cultural side, I think we need to be thinking about those upstream causes of declining fertility as well. And that's where conversations around apprenticeships, career and technical training, again, ways in which young men are formed, boys are formed into young men and into old men, all the boys to men. All of these sort of conversations that we're seeing from people like Richard Reeves and other commentators who notice that men's performance in the labor market and especially at college levels is just not up to par. I think that is a bigger conversation than we have time to get into today, but recognizing that may be one of the core sources of declining fertility in the U.S. should make that take an even higher part of the political agenda. It's more than just singing marriage's praises, as wonderful as marriage is. It's not enough to just lip service your way into a pro-family culture. You need to examine what we can do to kind of make marriage more beneficial again, whether that's through the tax code or social structures or that sort of thing. A movement to make it easier to get married and start families would, in my opinion, reorient our politics in a more optimistic and future-forward direction rather than fighting a zero-sum game over the boomers versus the Gen Xers versus the Gen Zers. I think it would help get our politics, if we're focusing on those questions, it would get us out of the rut that we've fallen into where we're so bitterly divided on so many things. Cultural change, political change, these are all big questions. They're hard to do. There's no silver bullet. But recognizing that this is the root cause, that is not about the sticker price on childcare or college tuition and all the rest that we can try to spend our way out of. That's not going to ultimately address the failure to communicate, the failure to form relationships. Until we start asking the right questions, I don't think we're going to get the right answers. But hopefully the talk today kind of helped us at least initially embark on some of those questions. Thanks very much.
Dr. Regnerus is going to lead the Q&A with Patrick Brown. He's the president of the Austin Institute and a professor in sociology here at the University of Texas.
Patrick, thanks for coming today. A few questions about your talk. First, just an observation that there's a lot of bad news about marriage and fertility rates and things like that, and we're pining for good news. We're staring into the tea leaves, hoping for something. Do we reasonably have an expectation that things could get better, right? And if so, is it by policy or is it by, I mean, you mentioned culture change, which of course is It's like this black box of how do we get that to happen, right? What's probably the best piece of hope for people who would like to sort of see the marriage rate improve in general?
I think this is speculative, but the increasing anecdotal reports and even some survey data that suggests that I feel confident saying we've hit a stall out in the decline in religion in America.
Stall out or bottom?
Well, yes. Dead cats bounce too, right? I think that there's at least a hint that maybe we're seeing a revival. At the very least, we've seen a stall out and decline. That's good news because religious young people are more likely to get married. They're more likely to have kids, and it's especially interesting. And I'm sure you know this as well. It seems to be disproportionately focused among young men. I don't think we know whether it's college or non-college, but at least that need for formation and relationships, both fraternal and cross-sex relationships, that religion can provide. I don't want to sound too instrumental about it. Obviously, religion is about more than just the social benefits. But I think that if it is true that we're seeing young men return to church, we could see more, for relationships forming down the road. I think that would be a sign of hope.
Do you know if that is the case? And I used to be a sociologist of religion. I haven't paid nearly as much attention as I used to. Is that the case among working class men as well? Or do we not know?
I don't know. My suspicion is it's not. I think we're seeing a kind of how marriage and fertility are bifurcating along class lines. I think that, I know the Catholic Church statistics better than others, no disrespect to other denominations. What we see there is the places where conversions are highest is among college campuses and New York, D.C., places where there's a lot of college grads. Maybe it's an ecological fallacy, but I think there's a lot of college young men who are being attracted to a more formal set of religion. I don't think we're doing as good a job talking to the sort of maybe Joe Rogan crowd.
What about working class women? Is there a sense that they want marriage? I mean, if their working class male compadres are basically voting with their feet, what do the women think?
Well, I think they're voting to not have kids. I mean, this is where that shift of not, black fertility is now lower than white fertility for the first time in decades, and Hispanic fertility is also sharply declining. I think the sense, and there's plenty of culprits to this, where young minority men face a lot of more disadvantages in the labor market, criminal justice. We can have that whole conversation, but I think if they're not finding partners who they find attractive on any number of dimensions, they're not having kids. Whether the church can do better in those conversations, probably, but I think that's the core of the root there, the core of the problem.
You talk in the first part of your speech about marriage being the victim of its own success, or we've been the victim of our own success. People don't need to get married anymore, which is totally the case. Is it possible that we talk about ways to turn this around a little bit? What do you think about sort of navigating marriage in a like a 100-year horizon where it's not turning around? It becomes the kind of the template of the minority and the more successful, probably not the most successful, but the more successful. I mean, is it possible that we keep looking for answers, and the real work ought to be in figuring out what's the best we can get for those of us who actually think a society where people generally marry is a good thing? Because we're talking about data that's rolling in the wrong direction, and we've been talking about it for a long time, right? What do you think?
I mean, I can't even think about what 100 years from now is going to look like.
It comes faster than you think.
Well, if you would ask me what ChatGPT was 5 years ago, I'd have no clue. And now I don't feel confident about anything anymore. Yeah. But no, I think we're going to see the sort of continued bourgeoisification of marriage, right? Where people who otherwise have their lives together in other domains also get married and have kids, and their fertility rates will be pretty steady. And this is where, like, our mutual friend, Dr. Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia, has all these charts, which are great charts, and they show married women are happier and all these sort of things. And it's just tough for me to take them at too much of face value, because I think they reflect a large degree of selection into marriage. People who are, detail-oriented and committed and sort of have that trajectory of wanting to, hit all these boxes, those are the people who also have success in finding a spouse. So that correlates with all these other things. I agree. I think that the sort of future in which we have a, soft caste system of the people who are knowledge workers and can adapt to a postmodern economy versus people who are, driving for Uber. Well, I guess they won't be driving for Uber because we'll have Waymo. But whatever the 22nd century version of service sector jobs looks like, I do not have a lot of confidence that we're going to navigate that well. But we have to at least be not prescribing the wrong solutions. And that's where I think the sort of, well, if we only had free childcare, or if we only had, single earner households like we did back in the 1950s, those are the wrong solutions. I don't think we actually get there very far with those.
Back to the working class men, which I think in some ways are the great concern of a lot of us. You talk about 1 in 4 young men use marijuana regularly, rise of crypto, sports betting, prediction markets, all this stuff. I've seen my own family members, my nephews dabble in that, and it resonates. What do you think are, so the success sequence makes a lot of sense. Even though the success sequence doesn't actually talk about, like, don't use marijuana, don't bet on sports, that sort of thing. What are the sensible deal breakers for a woman with a high school degree who didn't go to college or went to college for a couple years and decided that wasn't for her? What does she have to sort of insist on, right? In some ways, we're selling the same vision of marriage to the rich and the poor, and at some level, we want the poor, working class, to benefit from it, but we're tying too much of the sort of strings of the middle class stuff to it. What should they tolerate?
Yeah, no, that is a really great question, and I don't have a lot of confidence that I have the right answer. In fact, I have almost zero confidence I have the right answer. I mean, it's obviously going to depend on the culture and the family and all the rest. I think having certain red lines and that sort of thing is always useful. You want to be discerning, the best you can. I'll say, without being too prescriptive on some of that stuff, that we have done a tremendous disservice to that woman by rapidly throwing up the floodgates when it comes to this sort of stuff. When there, obviously, marijuana, betting, these sort of things have always been around, but we've gone so quickly into this world where you have a casino in your pocket, at least in a lot of states, and all porn and all the rest that's so easy to access, that it's very hard to make the sort of individual choice to stand up against something that's much more tectonic and systemic in nature, right?
And addictive.
I'm sorry?
And addictive.
And addictive, right. And so we used to have a more, pre-liberal, I guess you might say, understanding that these industries, these vice industries, are so powerful because they're addictive that they need to be either confined to Las Vegas, or we need to have, rules around obscenity and that sort of thing. We've gone so far in that direction that I like to think the pendulum is starting to swing back the other way, that we can talk about, well, should there be advertising for sports betting on every broadcast or not? That will only help her in the sense of, like, changing the landscape. I just think it's really hard for any one individual to kind of stand again, with their finger in the dike.
So you said this pendulum is swinging back. How do tell me why you
I
think
think
that.
you're starting to see in Congress and some state capitals a recognition that, again, weed, for example, way more powerful today in terms of THC content than it was in the 1970s when people were, lighting up outside a Grateful Dead concert or something, right? It's a much more powerful, much more addictive substance with a lot more side effects now. That's something that policymakers did not account for when they started unrolling legal weed in 2012 and onwards. Similarly with some of the sports betting, obviously there's a ton of money in the industry pushing for it, but in states like Ohio and Georgia and other places, they've been crafting coalitions of both sort of Christian conservatives, but also, the sort of, again, Richard Reeves type centrists who recognize that the social outcome of this was not, we're just going to let people do what they've always done, but no, it actually creates its own demand once you allow capitalism to do what capitalism does so well, which is expand markets and make things as seamless and appealing as possible.
Back to the confluence of religion and education. At least anecdotally, I'm seeing evidence of people picking against going to college, men and women, religious men and women. In some ways, isn't this, a deeper dive into how they make it work would seem like a really good first step into understanding, are there multiple ways that you can do marriage besides the two-earner, both college grad vision?
Yep.
Unfortunately, the last thing is the only thing that's sold to us on media about marriage.
Yeah, that would be a fun research project for someone who does sociological work on religion and family. No, I think what that points to, though, is the need for these supportive structures, right? You don't have to go to college to find a spouse and get married, but college is a sort of concentrated time where you're meeting a lot of young people who you might share interests with. Similarly, if you go to church, you have these sort of ideally shared moral frameworks that you find other people who also share in those, and so that it leads to these relationships. I don't think there's any question that once you move in a world in which those are sort of stripped away, those thick moral frameworks that we used to have, we're much more individualistic, alienated, pluralistic, whatever you want to say, society now. It gets harder to match on core beliefs, but also just like, if you're dating someone in a closed environment like a church youth group or that sort of thing, and you treat the other person badly, you kind of expect that word is going to get out to the other people. And same on a college campus. If you're out in the great big world of Austin, Texas, or New York City or something, there's so much more anonymity, and I think it sort of rewards people who are willing to kind of cut corners morally and interpersonally. That's probably not great.
Thanks. Audience, questions out there?
The issue of fertility has been especially acute in Asia, and South Korea has enacted some government policies that has at least stemmed the decrease and maybe even slight increases. So it's sort of counter your argument that it's not really economically related. Is that just sort of a coincidence that's happened, or is there some fundamental underlying cultural related issues as well?
No, that's a great point for those who aren't familiar. South Korea's fertility rate got down to, you can correct me if I'm wrong with the exact numbers, but something around 0.7 births per woman, and most demographers will say you need about 2.1 births per woman to avoid decline, because obviously for every 2 people that die, you need 2 people to replace them. So 0.7 is pretty low, catastrophically low, some might say. And they've been able to raise it to, I'm going off memory here, but it's something like, 0.79, 0.81, something like that. Yeah, right. It's not going to change the trajectory dramatically, but it is a hopeful sign, and it's broader evidence that the relationship between marriage and fertility is actually the critical one to focus on. They spent a lot of money, and this is what Hungary did too, on the other side of the globe, spent a lot of money on tying benefits to marriage, making it easier for young married couples to get a home loan, childcare support, and these sort of things. and you can see in the data that the people who responded most were not young single sole residents, but actually people who were married and looking to have their first kid. They had felt a little more stability. So I think I'm not counseling that there despair here. There are actual policy interventions. I would love to see greater first-time homebuyer assistance for young married couples than we currently do. I think that would actually have a big impact. But it's recognizing that single parenthood is a huge burden for a lot of people, and that it's always going to be easier to share that load with a spouse, and that if you're not addressing getting people married in the first place, that the biggest chunk of falling fertility is just not getting married in the first place at all. So South Korea, I think, is a good example. Now, to just tag on Hungary, their birth rates actually, they did have a little bump. They've actually come back down a little bit, and the biggest change that they saw was they, similar to the U.S., had been seeing a huge spike in the share of births to non-married women, like we did in the 70s and 80s, and they've seen a huge plunge because of so many of their benefits being tied to marriage. So that's not great on the sort of broader fertility front, but if it means that more Hungarian babies are being raised in a two-parent household as opposed to a one-parent household, then maybe it's worth the money.
Hi, so I believe in your talk you hinted a little bit at not only the economic conditions for marriage, but basically part of the problem is men aren't doing well economically. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe a little bit elaborate on some of the maybe uncomfortable implications of that. For example, we've kind of been talking about sex different roles, and men and women are different, but then it also seems like there's a little bit of, well, we're feminists and we kind of want to have all the greater opportunities. And so to what extent do we need to maybe fundamentally re-examine things like even the Civil Rights Act and employment discrimination when they might be, for example, subsidizing women over men or preventing sort of things that would allow men to have more economic benefits over women for fertility? And if we're not willing to do that, to what extent will it eventually be solved anyways, demographically?
Yeah, I think this is a question that's been kind of growing. People kind of saying, well, what can we do to try to put maybe the genie back in the box a little bit when it comes to the Civil Rights Revolution, the sort of shift in the economy from a goods-producing powerhouse as we were in the sort of wake of World War II to an economy that's increasingly services driven, in which since January 2025, just picking a date out of random, the economy has actually net, if you other than home health care aides and nurses, we've lost jobs. All the job growth in the last year and change has been in these sort of traditionally very female-coded sectors of the economy. I don't think that's a big conspiracy or a thumb on the scale against manufacturing, although certainly sort of chaotic tariff policies don't help. We can talk about that at another time. But I think it's a sign that as a nation gets older and wealthier, and more automated, and offshoring and some of these other things that have happened already. I don't think you can rewind the clock on that. The sort of in-person service sector economy, you can't import a haircut, right? You still need someone to be there to provide that, or to change the bedpan in the nursing home. Those jobs are highly female concentrated. I don't see a lot of men applying for them, and so this is sort of the subcurrent along a lot of these debates, and so I don't see a way of reversing that anytime soon. I also don't think it's probably particularly useful to think about ways of that you might there's clearly a relationship between the higher female educational attainment and labor force participation and lower fertility. You see this across the globe. But my argument is that once you decompose that and you see that the women who are more college educated are also more likely to get married, and they're the ones whose fertility is most stable, I don't think that the way you unwind that is to say, well, let's have fewer women go to college. I think you have to be thinking about these other dynamics that we've been talking about today.
First you, and then
I'm going to speak purely like from anecdotal experience, but I would expect somewhere like the UT Catholic community, you know, both religious and I guess well-educated, of good status, to be like having more dating relationships and couples like pursuing engagement then. But from what you said, but from my experience, like there's a big mismatch there because there isn't much more dating going on, I would say, than the normal college secular community. Yeah.
That's a problem, right? I think any religious, particularly religious institution, should be seeing itself as a little bit of a dating agency in today's modern times. You know, churches, student centers, even maybe high schools if I want to really be edgy here. But any place that is concerned about the moral formation of young people and helping them succeed. We spend so much money, I'm sure UT is no exception. So many college campuses spend millions of dollars on career centers and resume reviews and job training, mock trial, and whatever. There's nothing about, what careers are conducive to if you're a woman who wants to be able to flex in and out of the labor force after you've had a kid or two, or what are ways that we can be, doing more speed dating or whatever. I think it's easy, it's low-hanging fruit for religious institutions to pick that up, and I hope they do. But it would be fun to see some again, I don't know if we need a center of marriage formation on the UT campus, but we should at least have the conversation.
It's an interesting point because there is a building in the middle of campus that unless they've changed the engraving, it still says home economics on it. And every time I used to pass that, I would recall the home economics class I had in high school a long time ago, which taught me some valuable things that I actually still do, compared to most of the stuff I learned in trigonometry or biology, where the football coach just basically turned on films and we watched them while he plotted the next game. So I think a university could actually do such a thing because kids don't know how to balance a checkbook, but then again, we don't even use checks anymore.
Oh, yeah.
So these kinds of financial management, household, like purchasing a home, you don't really know what you're getting into. What does a mortgage entail? What do you owe? All these kinds of questions, they're kind of on their own to figure it out eventually, which is frankly unfortunate.
Yeah. Don't rely on DoorDash.
So, because traditionally men, kind of their value in marriage was, economic, like being the breadwinners, and now that's not the case, right? Because women don't need that as much anymore and kind of can be their own, depend on themselves financially. So how do we fix that for men, in the sense that, like, how do they feel valuable now in a marriage so that they are not, like, intimidated by that change where they're no longer needed as a breadwinner?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
I think that they do feel valued as a breadwinner, not necessarily the breadwinner anymore, but it's one of those things where marriage used to rely on a sort of an exchange of goods and services in some ways. And in reality, I think most marriages still operate that way, not very explicitly so, but implicitly so. I mean, if you ask them questions, they might give you an account of how, we're jointly sharing all of these things. And yet, in reality, they're gifting things back and forth to each other. They're doing things for the other. So, yeah, it goes back to the question, I think, about the men who feel like they don't have a lot to offer. I'm not really worried about middle and upper middle class men eventually figuring out that they're better in a stable union with a woman than they are apart from that. Sometimes it takes them a long time to figure that out. But it's really about the guys at the the edge of society, and there's a lot of them who don't feel like they are worthy of marriage. They didn't really learn a lot of patterns or habits around it. You know, go back to the home ec thing. It's like we need modern home ec for people. It's funny, now that I start saying it, I'll probably see it in Facebook feeds and shorts, but we're fed media that kind of reflects what we're thinking about, asking about, and talking about. So that in my line of work, I study all this stuff, I'm inundated with biographical accounts of why I should get a divorce, why you should get a divorce, why I can handle 4 kids, 6 kids. I mean, it runs the spectrum on marriage and family. But it means that our techno overlords here in town and in Silicon Valley and other places are really kind of, they're in charge of the narratives that are permitted. And I think they have some responsibility that they have not accepted about the direction in which their own societies flow. And it's a global phenomenon. I mean, it's not just them affecting us, it's them affecting how people think about marriage and childbearing and rearing across the West and the non-West. So, great question, April.
You.
I think we're...
Now we will have Dr. Regnerus' remarks. I mentioned before about him, but I will just give like a short introduction. Dr. Regnerus is a professor of sociology here at the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on sexual behavior, family, marriage, and religion. And he also serves as the president of the Austin Institute. If you are not familiar with the Austin Institute, you can also there's another QR code where you can find more information and sign up for our newsletter so you can be on the loop of our events. And with that said, we'll hear from Dr. Regnerus.
Thank you, Maria. Welcome to this. Thank you for coming today. I am just going to have maybe 10 to 12 minutes of observations about marriage as kind of a pivotal voluntary institution, if not the most important pivotal voluntary social institution in our life. And we keep hearing about how it's subject to a variety of tensions, pressures, selling the same vision to people who can afford it and people who can't. What to do about it? Is there a policy that we can push? Is there a demographic shift that needs to occur? I just want to offer just a handful of baseline remarks about this, largely from topics and themes that I haven't studied myself, but have observed in the last 5 to 10 years about sort of what's gone wrong and what could possibly go right. But one of the things that's true is marriage as a social institution is fairly helpful and important for human happiness and wide social flourishing. Not everybody has to enter into it to benefit from it. I think people who grow up or live now around communities of fairly healthy marriages benefit from those marriages without actually participating in them, in the way of friendships, friendly neighbors, things like that. So it's an institution that like everybody benefits from, whether they're in it or not. But we're increasingly picking against it. Are we picking against it because we dislike it? Because its terms are too difficult? I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case. The fact is we need each other. Human beings need each other. Husbands and wives need each other. But we're increasingly living in a social order where we can make it on our own, and hence the bar for our ability to deal with normal marital and family difficulties has risen. When you needed it to survive effectively, you entered it, or you pushed into it, socially pressured into it. That no longer exists. So there's so many odd and unhelpful developments we have seen as marriage recedes, as childbearing recedes. And yet, this thing we call society still persists. One keeps thinking, oh, where's the bottom here? And yet, social order is generally maintained. Society persists. We make a way despite these difficulties. We have unbundled marriage, as Patrick said. But if in fact marriage is a luxury good, then I think we're in serious trouble over the long run. Not a trouble that will happen overnight, or a trouble that you'll even notice year to year. When I was sitting there talking to Patrick, I kind of griped around tech. I'm going to return to that theme because it has a role to play here, both a corrosive and a potentially positive role. Technology has encouraged our decoupling from each other and from marriage. There's just no way around it. We don't need it as much. I'll give you one example. I didn't used to travel far away very often, and when I did, I was stressed, right? I could not reach out and easily get a hold of my family. I mean, it's hard to believe now, but 25 years ago, it was a much more complex world of communication. Right? If you went across the ocean, good luck. Those calls home were expensive, and you didn't make them if you didn't have to. So now, in some ways, our technology connects us, which is good for marriage, but it's also sort of bad for it in a way. It's like we are getting a fix of sociality, without having to be proximate to persons, especially to your spouse or to your family. As I'll get back to that one in a second. So technology has enabled our decoupling from each other and from marriage to some extent. It has also enabled greater longevity, right? If you think about the health benefits of technology, those are obvious to people. But we have better physical health now, or at least the capacity to, a straight line to it for many people. But we clearly have poorer mental health than we used to. And it's the result of the very same source. Technology has harmed our mental health, helped our physical health, which leads us to the question of human flourishing. Our online life. So my ability to reach my wife at most hours of the day, 5,000 miles from here, has been a positive for me. I don't like to be out of touch, and it's good for me to talk to her. But even the fact that I can talk to her means I can go a day or two without doing so if I had to. But I don't have to. Our online life can inspire us, but it's more likely to bring us down socially, make us question our own judgments, make us second guess our decisions. make us feel like we don't belong and that we're not good enough. I see it in students. I see it in family members. I occasionally see it in myself. I think at age 55 I should be past some of that, but like it still fosters that. These are toxic to relationship formation and to relationship maintenance. The result has been bad for this deepest of relationship, marriage. We get dopamine hits from strangers responding to us on X or on Instagram. Like we get a kick out of it. We don't even know them. We haven't met them. But it does something for us that we weren't able to experience in previous eras. I'm not criticizing you for the dopamine. You don't control your dopamine hits. They come, they feel good, they go. You want more. That's not your fault. I'm not criticizing that. We're able to connect with many more friends and acquaintances. So we feel more socially connected. And kind of, in some ways, we can get by without marriage because we feel socially connected, right? And it's not a criticism of people who don't marry. It's just, I'm thinking of how does this affect the institution itself? But the one person who we could form a family with, that feels not so pressing today. That feels not as urgent and more difficult to figure out. In some ways, I feel like we're experiencing this slow-moving divine judgment. Oh, Western society, you think you don't need this anymore? Well, you'll change your mind someday, and by then it'll be too late. And that's the plural you. And yet society somehow still persists. But it's getting weaker, slowly. And in the more rural parts of our country and our state, I think it's getting weaker faster. I grew up in one of those rural parts of the country in Michigan and Iowa, where I thought it was a good place to grow up. Tough place to find work, good place to grow up, and now I think it's experiencing the burden of some of these they have the tech hits, the dopamine, the lack of connection, but in a social and economic space that it's emptying out. That harms families. The challenge is that we can't fight a social problem by convincing people one person at a time. Our problem is social in nature. It requires sort of social solutions that are very difficult to make happen. So back to the text solution, right? Or lack thereof. I think about what is technology's solution to low birth rates, okay? So we're talking here in this about both low fertility and marriage challenges, and they are correlated, but they also have distinctive sort of ways in which we think about solving them, okay? Nobody in Washington or in Brussels is thinking about how can we help marriage. Very few, if any. Not in Brussels, for sure. In Washington, very few and poorly done. Lots of people are thinking about how do we help low fertility. So let's turn to the tech bros. What's their solution to low birth future? More tech, right? Not having babies? Well, we can make babies in other ways. We're getting really creative. We're at the cusp of sort of technological breakthroughs in how we can have more children. So we can actually pull that out of the family, out of the marriage, and probably still get by in what strike us as draconian, grotesque approaches, which I think are going to be more popular in the future. But tech can't make marriages happen. They have made people connect. They have provided dates and hookups for billions of people. We can get more babies through tech, sadly, I'd say, but we can't get more marriages through tech. We can't guarantee a child the love of a mother and a father through technology. So, it's a tough line of work to be in, talking about marriage and family these days. The best we can seem to hope for is connecting people. And I think the Austin Institute does a great job of actually connecting people. Which is in terms of the humanity of a person and the personhood factor, this is pivotal, right? Connecting human beings. But in a conversation like this, we turn our attention not just to the local, but to the national and the political and the international. We think, well, what can we do to foster more marriages? That's where it really gets difficult. Not just because our politicians won't listen. Part of me thinks, I don't care if the politicians listen. Like, we're not going to get out of this mess politically, so far as I can tell. There's some steps we can take that are helpful. But we're talking about addressing the recession and child rearing and its union, its ideal union, marriage, in a cultural fashion. Because really, marriage is culturally proscribed. It's a cultural institution. So, you've heard two people talk about various aspects of this, and this is probably as pessimistic as I get. Usually I'm a little more optimistic. But we're in difficult straits on marriage, and it's worth our time and our focus and our interpersonal interactions with people to remind them of the good of this form of union. So on that semi-dismal note, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Maria, who's going to introduce our dear friend Matt Breuninger, who's a psychologist, and maybe he can help me, and he could probably help you.
Now, as Professor Regnerus said, we will hear from Dr. Matthew Breuninger, an old friend of the Austin Institute. Dr. Breuninger is a licensed clinical psychologist. He's a former professor of psychology at Franciscan University and is the founder of Wellspring Counseling and Coaching. His talk is titled Ready? Yes. Perfect? Never. On becoming committed adults. Please help me welcome Dr. Breuninger.
All right. The energy in the really ended on a nosedive there. Tough to follow. Here's what I want to give. I want to give a couple introductory remarks, sort of thoughts, just to get you thinking for the panel. So far from sort of the well-polished lectures that we've heard before, these are sort of maybe more the ramblings of a madman, but here's what I want to start with. I got married when I was 32 years old, the day before my 32nd birthday. And I married a woman who already had 3 children. She had been divorced and had 3 kids, and at this point, I was in my 4th year of doctoral studies. I'm a clinical psychologist. Like, I've worked on myself. I'm like the Oracle at Delphi said, like, I know myself. And I'm a man of mastery and patience and peace. And I will never forget the first night we're back from honeymoon. Literally my first night living in the same house as these 3 children that are now mine. The 3-year-old walks in the door, like the door, I go to sleep, I tuck them in, like I'm a dad now, you know? I tuck them in, I kiss them. About 3 in the morning, the 3-year-old kicks the door open. And it's these Texas homes with sort of the cheap hollow doors. And I mean, it scared the hell out of me, right? Boom, and I stand up, jump up. And he says, "Mommy, I threw up." And I was like, oh my God, this is crazy, right? So I go in his bedroom. And there's vomit all over the bed. And I thought, you know what though, man, this is what it's been all about. Like, I'm a dad now, man. The beautiful gift of fatherhood. And so I lovingly take the sheet. My wife didn't even have to ask me. I take the sheets off the bed, right? She's cleaning him up. I put new sheets on, new fitted sheets. I climb back in bed. I tuck him back in. I kid you not, 15 minutes later, boom, door kicks open. He threw up again. I was like, no, I did the loving dad thing already. So now I'm feeling I'm trying to fall asleep. See, what I didn't realize was for the past, 31 years of my life, I got 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. And all of a sudden, this kid has just woken me up, right, 2 times in the last 15 minutes. And so I get up. I go, now that we're out of sheets. And so now I'm putting towels on the bed, okay? And my wife says, let's bring him into bed with us. We'll just bring him into bed with us. I'm like, okay. So now I'm laying in bed with this 3-year-old and my new wife, and I'm starting to feel a little bit frustrated. It's a queen-size bed. It's small. See, up until the day before this day, I had my own bed. I'd always had my own bed. I didn't have a 3-year-old with a knee in my back. And now I've got a 3-year-old with his knee in my back, and he's already woken me up, but look, I'm a dad. I've done the work, y'all. And all of a sudden he sits up and he goes, oh no, right? And he throws up all over the bed. So my wife takes him into the bed. Now my wife is this beautiful, saintly woman, and she picks him up and she takes him into the bath, and he's crying because he's covered in puke, and she's cleaning him off, and she's saying, baby, I'm so sorry. You're okay. I'm so sorry. You feel so sick. That's so terrible. And I'm angrily now taking sheets off a 3rd bed for the 3rd time, and I'm thinking to myself, I kid you not, that kid is so selfish. What? I'm a 32-year-old man who's going to be a licensed psychologist, and I'm going, man, he's doing this on purpose, right? Now, it's 3 in the morning. I've been woken up 3 times. What's my point here? My point is that all the work I had done, all the therapy I had done, all the books I had read, all the growth I had done, didn't adequately prepare me for the fact that there are certain ways that that marriage and parenthood uniquely invite you to grow and heal, that are otherwise really challenging to either figure out or find. If you had asked me, Matt, are you selfish? I would have been like, no, I'm not. I give generously, I'm a good friend, I'm a patient listener, no, I'm not selfish. It took a 3-year-old waking up 3 times, and I was like, oh, yeah, dude, I'm selfish. If you said, Matt, are you patient? I would have been like, absolutely. I listen to the problems all day of people. I hold their hearts. I enter their pain. This 3-year-old child who's now my son is sick. And I am like, I'm done. I'm fed up. I would say my frustration tolerance has grown over a decade of marriage, and thank God for that. But there's this idea, I think, that sometimes is sort of fomenting in the culture that in order to get married, you have to be ready. You have to be perfect. You have to have done all the work. And I just think that that's an impossible task, because there's work to grow and heal that marriage and family life in some way uniquely brings to your awareness. And you actually heal best in community. So let me begin my remarks. So we've talked a little bit about technology here, and I want to add maybe 3 things that I notice from sort of the swipe culture that was mentioned before. 2 to 3 downsides to this sort of swipe culture. The first is, we learn in the swiping culture that there's always something better out there. That there's always more perfection to be had, a better image to be had. I see this a lot in my private practice when I work with men who struggle with pornography addiction. And a lot of these men end up being very dissatisfied in their marriages and in dating because there's this looming question, what if there's something better out there? And I think this is partially a function of the fact that Instagram, Twitter, like, you can always try to find a slightly more perfect image, a slightly better image. If you open my Instagram right now, the main page, I don't know why the algorithm, it may know me better than I know myself, but you will find, I just did it when I was outside. It's all buff dudes with no shirts on, lifting weights and flexing. That's weird, right? Because that's obviously not my lifestyle. But here's what it does for me, right? These sorts of things, and I do not mean this please take no offense at this. But these sorts of things, when I get out and I get to be around guys like Mark and Patrick, and I remember what like a 40-year-old body is supposed to look like. Do you know what I mean? If I'm looking at the algorithm all day, I start thinking, I am not living up to what a 40-year-old man should look like. Because the day in the life of the average 40-year-old on Instagram is wake up at 5:30, drink your protein shake. You hit the gym and you're hitting every muscle group, and like, if this is even what you do when you work out, I don't know. Because I don't work out, but this is what Instagram tells me, right? And these guys have backs and traps and lats and right? And part of the problem with that, right, and it goes both ways. It goes women to men and men to women. Part of the problem is you start thinking, yeah, but maybe there's somebody a little more beautiful out there. Yeah, but maybe there's somebody who's like a little funnier, a little more intelligent, a little more. The algorithm gives us this sort of foments this mentality. Second thing it does is we don't have to tolerate things we don't like. We don't have to tolerate things that feel like a waste of time. The algorithm is always giving us what we want. And this is, for those, if you're over a certain age, you used to have to grow up with commercials. And commercials were like this interlude between shows you were watching that just made you like you had to practice boredom, right? And I had to watch a Tide to Go commercial, or I had to watch a commercial about health insurance while I'm trying to watch Woody the Woodpecker. And there's something actually beneficial about that. Now here's something fascinating. This is a radical aside, but Netflix, Amazon, right, all the Prime, I paid good money to not have to have commercials. That's what these sites were. They were places for me to binge watch. Have you noticed that they added commercials back into your favorite shows on Amazon, and now you have to pay extra to not have commercials? That's what it was. That's what I already did at the beginning. But there's something about it. I refuse to pay now that money because I actually think there's something about having to sort of quote unquote waste time, to not always have exactly what I want tailored and given to me whenever I want it. And swiping and scrolling and allows me to do this. I don't like something, scroll, find something I like, boom. And it hijacks all these dopamine circuits we've talked about, etc. But it also makes us simply intolerant to this feeling of what if I'm wasting time? And so a bunch of you noted this on your questionnaires. One of the impediments to wanting to date and long-term commitment was, what if I pour my whole heart into this and it's a waste of time? We've sort of lost our capacity to tolerate this feeling of wasting time. And to realize that just because we're not getting exactly what we want doesn't actually mean it's a waste of time. And I think that's particularly important. Okay, second thing, social comparison. Obviously, social media allows me to compare my insides to your outsides. So if you look at most social media accounts, I do not feel the way those guys look. I do not feel the way they look, regardless of what sort of domain whether I'm looking at therapists on social media or speakers or academics, it is tailored, it's polished, it's fresh, I know how Matt Breuninger feels on the inside, and it does not feel the way you look. And this creates a sort of deep anxiety, I think, for many of us, that the mask will be pulled out, that if we actually interact, if you actually got to know me, you'd be deeply dissatisfied with who you came to know. Third, maybe final point about what technology does here, it's this sort of safe space culture. We've learned, I think, that to be uncomfortable is a problem. Now, I think there is I think there is a place, when we use the phrase safe space, there's a place where people should be able to go where they do not feel constantly sort of attacked, on guard, overwhelmed, that offers them a place to sort of recharge, refresh, so that they can step back out into the world and re-engage. We need places like that. That's what my family is in some ways, right? That's what my deep friendships are. We need places where we can actually feel safe, known, valued, seen, not critiqued in harmful ways, not criticized. And then that gives me sort of the resilience to go back out and re-engage the world. But we've sort of gotten this message that in no space in the public sphere should you ever feel uncomfortable. And that ends up being a problem because maybe you intuit this, but in marriage, you will be deeply uncomfortable. Like, marriage is this place where it feels like I see myself, I know myself, my old wounds pop up, my faults, my failings, my wife, after 10 years of marriage, 12 years of marriage, I find out my wife has a totally different view on a particular topic. What? How did I not know that? Uncomfortability is in many ways exactly what I need to grow. But we've sort of been sold this idea that no, sort of everything you should do should feel comfortable, safe, secure. And I'll try to maybe talk about, nuance that a little bit more later on in how marriage should feel safe and secure. But there are ways that marriage, in the context of feeling safe and secure, should challenge you deeply, make you deeply uncomfortable. Because that's precisely how I see myself and how I heal. Okay. A couple thoughts about what you might need to be ready for marriage. And we can we can flesh these out a little bit more. But the first, I think, is a capacity to be vulnerable. I think marriage requires a deep and profound capacity to be vulnerable. To be willing to share these parts of myself that feel hard, feel scary. They might be painful, might be embarrassing, might be shameful. It's the ability to step beyond a sort of cultivated or curated image and show you me. The second is a certain level of self-mastery. I think in marriage there has to be some baseline level of self-mastery. And what I mean by this is marriage certainly helps me foster greater self-mastery, but if I'm pulled in the direction of my desires at every minute, marriage is going to be a committed relationship is going to be incredibly difficult and challenging. So I have a 16-year-old daughter who is, she's beautiful. She's just exquisitely beautiful. And we put her on a plane last night to Austria all by herself. She's flying to Austria to visit her best friend all by herself. So I didn't sleep super well last night. Okay, but here's what I've noticed. I will walk with my daughter in the grocery store, out and about, right? And I will see now the gaze of men look at her. And I've been walking with my 16-year-old daughter, and I've watched guys we've walked past, I've watched them turn and look at her. To not have adequate mastery over your eyes, over your gaze, over your desires, how terrible would it be to be, first of all, it's terrible to be her father and to see that. It's terrible to be her and to feel that. But imagine if she's somebody's girlfriend someday, somebody's wife someday, and her husband has to snap his neck every time a beautiful body walks by because he has no mastery over his eyes. How sort of demeaning and how awful would that feel? There is a certain level of mastery, and that's sort of an entry level, a sort of ability to have custody over your eyes. But we talked about gambling and addiction. If I don't have adequate ability to say, no, I'm not putting money down, I'm not betting, you can do some serious harm. And I see this. I work with people with addictions, the harm it does to marriages, to families, to finances, etc. coming back to sort of sexual self-mastery, since this is relevant to the topic, but after a woman gives birth, it is generally recommended that for 6 weeks there is no sexual intimacy. And the number of married couples I work with where the husband feels unable to not engage in sexual intimacy for 6 weeks and either starts pressuring the wife or turns to pornography because he can't adequately contain and restrain himself, and then the harm that does to the wife and to the marriage, it is not an insignificant number. And so, so there's a certain level of self-mastery we have to have going into marriage. And the third I'm going to highlight, I think, is just willingness. And what I mean by that is a sort of willingness to look at, explore, engage anything that your spouse invites you to. Like, there's a whole bunch of ways that I am not the husband my wife needs me to be, but I'm willing to go to any lengths to do that, to be that. And so if she holds something up and says, Matt, this bothers me, there's nothing off the table that I'm not willing to look at. And for me, I see this place in marriage where one spouse says, nope, that's an area I'm not willing to look at. And so a sort of baseline level of openness and willingness to look at whatever your spouse invites you to look at. Okay, maybe 3 more points here, and then I kind of want questions. I think this is better with questions. The first is, and this is we've said this in various ways, but you are social creatures, and we can't understate that. And this is why I've actually come to be quite, I think I really do see, my definition of trauma has broadened as I've grown as a therapist. So I was trained in a model where trauma is only what they call criterion A traumas, like threat to like loss of life or limb, like something was blown up around you, you were robbed, you were assaulted, there was explosions, a building collapse, a car crash. Those are criterion A traumas. I've actually come to believe that developmental trauma, or what we might call interpersonal trauma, is every bit as troubling. And part of it's because I take very seriously this idea that we are social creatures. So when a father walks out on his family, I think we can call that traumatic for the children. When there's infidelity, I think we can call that traumatic for the spouse. When we are bullied or ostracized or picked on, I think we can call that traumatic, because our brain is so uniquely wired for social connection. By the way, this is how how do we punish the worst of the worst prisoners with isolation? We think that the best way to punish you is to isolate you for 23 hours a day. And overwhelmingly, what do we see from people who get isolated for 23 hours a day? They lose their minds. Cognitive decompensation. We are such social creatures. So why do I say that? I say that because it is so often that we are hurt in relationships, but it's also the case that we oftentimes, most frequently, heal in relationships. This idea that you can somehow like sort of sit in a dark room and read enough books and read enough self-help books and do enough introspection that you can like get yourself adequately healed to then be in relationship, I think is the wrong idea. I heal in friendships. I heal in relationship. I heal in my marriage. This is why I think the best in psychotherapy is a healing relationship, right? And the best prediction, anyone guess what the best prediction of whether therapy will be successful or not is? Yeah, the quality of the bond, therapeutic rapport. It's the quality of the relationship. We heal in relationship. And so this idea that you have to be perfect before you can enter relationship ends up undermining the very thing that you need to actually grow and continue to heal, which is relationship. Okay. So, 2 final points. What marriage and committed relationships don't require? They don't require the absence of anxiety. You do not have to be like not anxious in order to enter a relationship. In fact, relationship will help you over time become less anxious. There's this you need one another. We need one another for co-regulation. Co-regulation. We need to connect with each other. So what do I do after a long day of work? I go home and I hug my wife. Why do I hug my wife? There's two reasons. One reason is I hug my wife because she's beautiful and she's awesome and she's lovely and she deserves to be hugged. So I hug her. The other reason is I have a long day, a stressful job. I'm overwhelmed. I feel like I sucked at work. And when I hug her, I feel regulated. She actually takes my central nervous system, which is sort of in fight or flight and protection mode, and when she hugs me, I go, I'm okay. Marriage is, on one level, marriage and committed relationships are all about co-regulation. It's about connecting with this person in front of me so that they feel okay. And that is a huge part of marriage. And when I work with couples in marital therapy, overwhelmingly, all I'm trying to do, here's the sole goal of the type of therapy I try to do. I try to help each party have the capacity to co-regulate and connect with the other. So I try to help the husband be able to say what he needs to clarify the signal and send it to his spouse so she can meet it with caregiving and connection. That's so scary. I'm sorry you feel so overwhelmed. That's awful. And he goes, yeah, it's awful. And then I try to help her clarify the signal, send it across to her spouse so he can co-regulate her. That must be so exhausting, love. I'm so sorry the day's been terrible. What an awful feeling. What ends up happening in marriages that go awry is each party interacts with the other from a place of protection or defensiveness, and they're not giving that deep need for connection. They're not having that deep need for connection met. So this is just to highlight that you don't have to combat your anxiety before you can get married. Marriage can be and should be, if it's a healthy marriage, regulating for you. Second thing, you don't need to fully know who you are before you get married. In so many ways, my identity is given to me through the gaze of my spouse. Now, the first place I get my identity, the first place that I experience my identity is through the gaze of my parents. So there's this, if I had more time, I'd show you this amazing video by this Harvard psychologist named Ed Tronick. And he does these experiments with babies called the still face experiments. And so you take a baby, and you have the mom and the baby interacting, and there's co-regulation, and there's joint attention, and they're vibing, right, in modern parlance. And then mom turns around, and she turns back, and she just stonewalls the baby for 2 minutes. And very quickly, the baby becomes dysregulated. Fussing, crying, pointing. Mom's not looking. Right? And soon the baby arches its back. It starts crying. And finally, mom's able to break, and she comforts the baby, and the baby calms down, and they rejoin, they reconnect. Mom regulates the baby. Why is this so important? It's so important because the first place that you came to understand yourself was through the gaze of your parents or caregivers. What did that gaze look like? Did they look at you like you were an annoyance, a nuisance, a problem, you were too much? Were they too busy for you? Did you not get their gaze? Your identity, how you think about yourself, your sense of self, is a gift that's given to you through the gaze of caregivers. But it doesn't stop there. It's a gift that continues to be given to you through the gaze of your spouse. And so you don't have to fully know who you are because there are parts of you that you can't see adequately through your own contemplation and introspection. You have to see yourself through the gaze of the loving mirror of somebody who sees you. And there are many ways that my wife sees me way more accurately than I see myself. And she gives me the gift of that. When I come home and I'm like, I suck, I'm terrible, I'm no good, I'm quitting, I'm done. And I see the way she looks at me, and she doesn't look at me with that harsh, critical condemnation that I'm looking at myself with. She looks at me with such tenderness and love and compassion and admiration. Right? You don't have to have yourself fully figured out in terms of your identity, because part of the gift your spouse gives you is the gift of seeing yourself more clearly. I'm going to just give this final point, and then I'm going to be quiet and ask for questions. What your spouse will do, what will happen in committed relationships, and you should be incredibly grateful for this. They will bore you. Your partner, your spouse, your girlfriend or boyfriend, they will bore you, and that is good. It is unrealistic to think, and it's a great pressure off you, because if they're boring to you, you get to be boring to them. Do you know how hard it is to try to be like up here shucking and jiving to my spouse to make her think I'm awesome all the time? That's miserable. That's too much pressure. It's too anxiety provoking. They will bore you. There will be parts of them that are just, I don't know, what's the word? Meh. Right? But guess what, y'all? There's parts of you that are just meh. And that's okay. And you can be with this person who you love and have committed yourself to and not have to be entertained all the time, not have to be entertaining all the time, not have to be presenting the shiniest, most sparkly version of yourself. They will bore you, and that's good for you. They will hurt your feelings. They will hurt your feelings. They will fail to be who you need them to be for you. There'll be times when you need to be regulated and you need somebody to lean into your experience, and they will not be there and they will not be available the way you need them or want them to be. This is a beautiful opportunity to grow in deeper intimacy and vulnerability with your spouse and to practice forgiveness. I think part of sort of the current culture, the sort of cancel culture, is that if you've been hurt or you've been offended, you're done with somebody. You can block them, you can delete them, you can write them off, the ease with which you guys can just scroll past or block people doesn't do us any favors when it comes to marriage, because the truth is marriage is me, in some ways, negotiating with my spouse repeatedly the ways I've failed to show up for her and that I've harmed and ruptured our relationship and trying to repair it. I miss my wife every day. And what I mean by miss here I miss her emotionally, certainly. But by miss, I mean don't give her what she needs, don't see accurately what she needs, or fail to provide something she needs. When I come home from work, and I immediately go to the refrigerator, because I'm a big baby and I get hungry, and I go to the fridge and I'm like, maybe dinner's not ready for 30 minutes, and I'm looking for a cheese stick or some apples or something. And my wife starts telling me about her day. This kid did this kid did this one's doing that. And I go, yeah. Oh, yeah, Oh, crazy. Okay. Whoa, babe, that sounds tough, right? And I'm not looking at her. I'm in the fridge. And then when she stops talking, I go, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put this one in timeout. I'm going to make this one clean the garage. This one's going to do this one, right? And she gets quiet and she walks away. Why? I just fixed it. Ladies in the room, what did my wife want? Anyone have any ladies in the room have a sense of what my wife wanted in that moment? Say it again? Yeah. She wants me to listen. Yeah, that's right. She just wants me to listen to, what about her? What? And I step in and I'm like, no, I'm going to fix it. And she didn't need someone to fix it. She was just telling me about how hard her day was. And not only am I distracted by looking in the fridge, but then I sort of totally undermine her and make her seem like she's incompetent by fixing it. That's not what she needed. Now, these are the little sort of disconnections in marriage that happen all the time. And I miss her like this all the time. What's important isn't that I've messed up. I'm going to mess up every day. What's important is that I come back to her and I say, babe, I'm so sorry. I missed you. You were trying to tell me about your day, and I was totally distracted. I want to hear about it. I'll make some tea. Let's sit on the couch. Tell me about your day. And I listen. Marriage is about rupture and repair. Committed relationships are about rupture and repair. And if we have this sort of false narrative that to need to repair, to have to forgive, is somehow a deficit in the relationship, then marriage is going to feel terrible. You're going to be hurt in marriage. But this gives you the opportunity to grow and flourish, actually, in a whole bunch of sort of character strengths and virtues that are deeply important. Marriage is going to trigger old wounds. There are going to be things that your spouse says or parts of you that they touch that are going to cause you to react because you have these sort of these pain points, these sensitivities that come from who and how you were raised. You can expect it. My goal is to begin to see how that's showing up and creating distance and disconnection in the marriage. Lastly, in marriage, you're going to have differing perspectives. Should you homeschool or send your kids to traditional school? Should you send them to public school or should you pay for private school? If one of you is a particular denomination, should the kids be raised Baptist or, Lutheran? If one of you is religious and the other's not, should they be raised in any faith at all? Should you, we have this little farm now, we have this little hobby farm, and we just had a cow, we have a cow that just gave birth. Should we be drinking raw milk, right? That's the great debate in our family. And how much should we be cleaning? So I tend to be a little lax when it comes to my wife's like, no, we need to dip the teats in iodine, and we need to wash each one of them off, and we have to blah, blah, blah. I'm like, babe, it'll probably be fine. Let's just... And now we're arguing about how long it should take to milk the cow, How clean should that, right? It's minor, right? But you're going to have different perspectives on all sorts of things. That is, if you're waiting to have somebody who's perfectly in line with every aspect and value you have, you're never going to find someone to commit yourself to. But to be able to navigate differences in perspectives in a way that doesn't jeopardize the marital bond or connection is what's most important. My wife and I can come to different perspectives on a topic, but she's mine. And our connection and our relationship is never at risk. Because how we're going to talk about it is going to matter quite a bit. We're not going to stonewall, we're not going to be defensive, we're not going to condemn one another, and we're not going to criticize one another. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm really interested in any questions you guys might have. Panel, no, never mind. Panel, let's do a panel. Yeah, thank you.
I don't want to be unfair to Dr. Breuninger. There will be questions from Dr. Breuninger, but we're going to have them already with all the speakers back, and we're going to have the panel. So it's going to be that format. That's the last format for the day. Okay, we're all here. I did promise there will be time for questions from Matthew. So there will be, at the very end, if we can cover some of the questions for you from the. I'll try to be multitasking, as women are famous for being multitasking. But what I wanted to say is that this is an occasion also for the speakers to ask questions to each other, which I think is helpful for everyone in the audience, because they have all been studying these same issues for many years. So the kind of questions that I can ask probably are things that none of you in the room are going to be like, oh, everyone knows that. So I think that can be helpful. So if there is any of the talks that stimulated you more than others, I was thinking that could be a place to start. I wanted to start us off from something that we haven't touched upon today. We did talk about pornography, but we didn't talk about something that is not exactly pornography, but is something that I think is putting marriage in a... It's more difficult to get married, I believe, and I would like to hear what you think. In a world where we talk about sex work, in a world where the act of sex can be a source of income completely detached from its biological, natural function, I do see a hard time in resurrecting not just marriage, but resurrecting feelings, resurrecting relationships. So the question for you is, do you think we can succeed in the attempt of creating again a culture that is welcoming marriage and welcoming family, while on a parallel lane there is another world that deals with human bodies as things?
That's your question, or
That's
somebody
my
else's?
question. That's my question. Anyone can take it.
Can we succeed in a world where there are parallel tracks? Well, at some level, sex work is very old, so it has been around. If in fact we have understood that families can succeed in such societies, then I can say, yeah, that can work, yeah, and has worked. It's different now today than it was before. But insofar as they don't really communicate with each other, they don't overlap. We have occupied that since a very long time ago. I mean, that's just straightforward.
Yeah, I might add that, though maybe in some ways the idea of sex work in this term is changing and evolving in the sense of now you have OnlyFans. Right. And so maybe these worlds, I mean, it used to be maybe in some sense that sex work was relegated to certain parts of town and it ran actually parallel, but it feels more like with things like OnlyFans now where men and women can, through technology, sort of sell sex, sexuality, pictures, images, videos of themselves, and now it's open to anyone. Even the pornography industry used to have some sort of exclusivity to it, but now anyone with a webcam or an iPhone can make tens of thousands of dollars a month, including college kids, right? I mean, you have college individuals on OnlyFans making money like it's just a job, and the problem is it feels like it does take what used to be parallel tracks and now overlap them because I don't know, I want to be in a committed relationship. I want to be like, I'm just a part of society. It's my job in a way now that is sort of exalted or elevated. The commodification of the body now becomes sort of mainstream and socially acceptable through things like OnlyFans in a way it hasn't been. So
yeah,
anyway.
I would just add that, like, we used to have a lot of conferences about the problems of hookup culture and people having sex, and then we transitioned to, okay, we're worried about people watching too much pornography, and then it was another, on OnlyFans too much, and pretty soon all of this will be competed away. We have AI sex bots, so there'll be just a plethora of, there won't be opportunities to make $10,000 a month on OnlyFans because everyone will have access to their own personalized Elon-powered, fantasy bot, and so. I think of this more of a technology problem than I do a human nature problem because to Dr. Mark's point, like, it's the oldest business for a reason, right? Until we have a greater handle on where our tech overlords are taking us and investing in these technologies, I think it's a pretty uphill battle.
I think Matt is right that the overlap is overstated, or like the running on separate tracks is overstated now, and frankly, it probably always has been overstated because there's, I have thought, like, if we actually knew how many women suffered from sexually transmitted infections that were given to them by their husbands in the past, like, it would be probably stunning numbers, but we have no such data. So yes, they can thrive because that has been around forever. The overlap is probably not nothing.
I would like to hear from Serena because I have the impression that the panel is very divided between men and women, but I will,
Yeah, I mean, I disagree, Patrick, with the technology versus human nature question. I mean, I do think it's a problem that's been around forever. I understand that. And I think it's a technology problem in that it's a technology that's exploiting a fundamental human weakness. And I think, Matt was talking about the ways that technology trains us in habits that make us kind of incapable of tolerating what it takes to be in a real relationship. Because what's happening on OnlyFans is not just the same thing that would be happening in a one-off trip to a brothel, right? Like, you're not just getting a physical release. You are paying for a parasocial relationship with a particular creator that you imagine you have a relationship with, but they don't make any demands on you, right? You don't have to actually pay attention to what's going on in their day. Like it's training you again to have that commodifying vision, not just of their body, but of other people as inputs to make you feel good. And that's really making it harder, I think, to then turn around and interact with the real people in your lives who you actually do have relationships with in a healthy way.
Yeah, and maybe, I think I've asked this question partly because I think that we can see a resurgence of the desire of marriage and family that comes detached from a lot of things that I would still think are premises for that. So maybe even just the social nature of the relationship. But we could go on for hours. So let's move to, there's one question that I see recurring, phrased in different ways, but it's been expressed by more than one person in the audience, that is, how to establish spaces for interactions that would foster relationships and that that would get towards marriage. Some other has said, is it really something that just charities can do or churches? Should it be a public effort? We did touch. Some of the talks did touch upon this, but do you have
What do you
ideas?
mean by public effort?
State involvement?
State involvement.
I don't know. And
information?
creating centers for family flourishing freaks me.
No,
it scares me,
that's
the
not an
idea,
idea.
but.
It's always been an institution of its own, somewhat self-governing. So the idea of getting the state involved in meeting is kind of odd. Now, some states have done that. I think there's some low fertility Southeast Asian states that are talking about, I don't want to say Korea or Singapore has made efforts towards that end because they're so desperate, really. But I think, I don't think we ought to do that, at least not that way.
Yeah, I think there's a lot you can do in fostering a community, like in your own church community is a good place, but then also even just in your home. Like I'm now, I'm married and I have kids, and like finally we're not grad students anymore. My husband has a real job and we bought a house and it's big enough that we can have people over, right? And I think that's one thing with the dual career model. If both people are working full-time plus, hospitality and community building can go by the wayside, and I think that hurts everybody, but single people in particular, because I think our social spheres have become so stratified and separated from each other. As I was saying, you guys probably mostly socialize with other people who are around the same age group as you, who are probably also in the same stage of life. That's great in one way, but I think if people like me are able to cultivate friendships with not only other moms and married people, but also single people, and have them bringing them together. If you want, you could play matchmaker, and if you're a single person, tell the aunties in your lives, if you want to be match made. I think that's great, because it often is through that second order social connections where you can find the best matches. But even just building together places where like-minded people come together physically and meet with the background association or knowledge that this is a group of people who is interested in family life, I think that helps a lot.
Yeah.
The one thing I would just, The one thing I would just add to that, and I'm all for more socialization, although, I think that's another example of where we're a little bit of a victim of our own success in the sort of Robert Putnam story of bowling alone, and greater economic, affluence leads to fewer spaces where we're relying on each other for things. So you're kind of having to compel people to gather in a way that they used to do so just sort of naturally. But one area where I think this sort of exposure therapy that Serena's talking about does actually have a difference is on desire for kids. And we have papers on this showing that there's a little bit of a mild contagion effect of baby fever, where if you're around other people with kids, especially women, perhaps unsurprisingly, start to breed their own desire for kids higher.
Have you smelled a baby's head, you guys?
Matthew, you wanted to add something to this?
Yeah, actually, just to piggyback off that point, my wife called me last night. I was in the hotel room and she had been hanging around some friends, and there was a baby And my wife was like, I think I am ready to be pregnant. And I was like, yeah.
You sound like my husband.
Yeah, I was like, hold on, yeah. We drive a 12-passenger van already, like legit, so we have to slow down. But look, I think one thing we did in grad school and in undergrad to sort of create, I think part of what happens is there's these social situations that when they do arise, feel like there are a lot of pressure too. They can feel high stakes. And I think sort of creating low stakes social environments. So like have dinner parties. In grad school, all of us single grad students would have dinner parties once a week. And we'd get together and somebody would cook and we'd bring something and we would just talk and hang out. And we were in different disciplines, English, philosophy, theology, psychology, and we could just talk and chat. And it was sort of low stakes, really enjoyable. We also got into watching shows together. So we'd watch Alone. We'd get together and watch Alone, which probably tells you how long ago I was in grad school. Anyone know the show Alone? Yeah. Okay, one person.
Mark.
Horrifying.
He was alone.
Horrifying to me. Yeah. But you can watch shows together, and it ended up being this really great time. We'd laugh a lot. We could talk about some of the deeper themes. But these were sort of low-stakes social opportunities where a group of single people could gather, enjoy one another's company. Generally, phones were down. And I think this is something we have to... One of the great tragedies I see, even when I see college kids socializing, is they will be sitting together at a table with one another, staring at their phones, because the phone is giving them more of a little sort of hit than the people in front of them. And I think we have to sort of be willing to subject ourselves to even the boring conversations of the person in front of us in these low-stakes social situations.
Yeah, bring back boredom. I agree. So there is time. I did mention, if you have questions for one another, if anyone of you is already ready to. Yeah, we do have another list. So it's just that I'm not that multitasking as you guys all think. Most of this have been addressed. One that hasn't been addressed is the idea, which is not just an idea. It's like this trend that is described that women. I don't understand if it's a question for the women or because it's phrased differently to the women and to the men. But that on the one end, to the women, it would be that I've heard that women want a guy who makes more money than them. Well, that's probably true to a degree, and then I have a hard time reading this, but when is the time when a combined income is enough? Is a woman that makes a lot of money still a woman that wants the man to make more money than her? So is that still relevant? And to the men, the same person says, on the other end, Jordan Peterson makes the point that women are not interested in incompetent men with lots of money. If this is the case, what are the kinds of careers that are attractive for two women that men could get so that they are competent? The psychologist that wants to answer to
No,
Jordan
I was just going to
Peterson.
say, just gut reaction really quick with that. Do not go into a career just because you want to attract a woman. Why are you a biomedical engineer? Well, I just wanted to find a wife. I mean, I think there's something to be said about...
I think a lot of civilization was made by men trying to impress women.
Yeah. No, I think you have to impress a woman. But you might find yourself in a career for 60 years that... Anyway, I'm interested in...
I don't think that happens.
Real answers.
Yeah, it does matter. As I was talking earlier to someone, when a woman makes notably more money than a man in the marriage, that's just a persistent divorce risk for the pair. I mean, you may not want it to be, but it totally is. And it reminds me, this is current, it reminds me of the film Up in the Air with George Clooney. And there's this conversation, very interesting conversation he has with this peer of his with whom he's having an affair, and this young 21-year-old, 22-year-old new employee in the company. And now the question is aimed towards the young girl is asking the older two this question, and then the one older woman who's like 35 or 40 says, "You won't understand me now, but just please let him make more money than you." And so I remember that line, and by the numbers, that's a consistent risk factor. Now, it shouldn't necessarily be so.
Why is it? Do you think it's because men can't
It's
can't
not
tolerate
really,
not providing, or what is
no,
the
I think it's not
mechanism?
just it's not one-sided, it's two-sided. He may be uncomfortable by it and feel awkward and less confident, but it also it enables her to leave the marriage. I mean, a lot of gray divorce now is not so much like people being fed up with their spouses after 30 years. They were always fed up with their spouse, right? They just can afford to leave now that the 401k and the housing value is so high. So there's just a persistent risk to lots of money in the household, frankly. I mean, I don't think money saves people from marital troubles. There's a threshold beyond which it eases a lot of things, but then there's a threshold beyond which it can create more problems because they know they can split.
I think this is an area that we're going to have to navigate, and I don't want to sound too post-structural feminist or something here, but I think as we're entering, or we have entered, really a world in which more women than men are getting bachelor's degrees, and soon they'll be approaching parity in graduate degrees and the rest. I think we're already seeing a rise in sort of educational mismatch marriages, where historically there were more men with BAs, so there were more who would sort of marry a lower education spouse and the wife. Now it's flipped, right? We're having more women who are open, at least, to marrying blue collar, non-college men. I think that would be an interesting study to kind of figure out where what works, what doesn't there. But that is going to be, and it's not necessarily money per se, but I do think that there is some level of social stability or standing, or even even if you're not bringing home the big bucks as a high school teacher, are you committed to your work? Are you passionate about it, or something where there needs to be an equality of commitment, or I obviously you can imagine a scenario in which the man is not working and sitting on the couch eating Cheetos or whatever, and the woman is slaving away. That seems like a pretty high risk of divorce. I think situations where they're both working, even if the pay is not commensurate, but there's some sense in which they both have skin in the game. I think that's probably, I would think, most important in this question.
I think it's going to be really interesting too, as AI kind of replaces a lot of white-collar work. I think one kind of very practical suggestion is for a guy who's trying to kind of become more marriageable is to consider something like a skilled trade, because I do think physical labor, it's a big problem for all of us, like how much we're living online, right, and how disembodied we are. And we've lost so many skills because we do live in such an affluent age. We don't have to mend our clothes, right? Like we can buy a cheap new version online. We can do, we get all of our physical needs met so easily. I can have my groceries delivered, all of these things. But we actually still are physical human beings who live in the physical world. And it actually is still important for you to be able to exercise mastery over that world and to make things creatively. And I think we're going to be seeing that realization more and more with AI being able to do all these digital things. We're going to realize, it actually is good for you to know how to, fix the drain or whatever, that's very, speaking from experience, I married a guy who, now he's like a physics professor, right? But he worked as a janitor through high school. And so then when we were in college, and he fixed his parents' cars, and all the girls were like, if you need something, call Anthony, he'll, and I'm because Anthony can fix it, and that's super attractive, guy,
Can I say, okay, we're speaking as women, because there is something about the two questions directed to women and directed to men that seems incoherent, but I think it's really coherent, because what has been defined on the question to women as money, and then described as a competence when described to men, is that I think women need to respect the men they're with. And respect doesn't come from the huge bank account that you just inherited from someone. Yeah. And it doesn't come from just muscles that because you have, you spend all the day at the gym. But it's are you committed? are you someone that cares about what he does, that would sacrifice, what he can to provide for the woman? So, I would think that, and you just, the question, I think itself reveals that there is some of that in the answer, right? But that woman needs to have a high opinion of the man she's with. Not saying that men don't, but like maybe women need it more.
Yeah, I think Sabrina's point about AI is really interesting, because I think that the age of people making big money on Wall Street in certain industries, AI is going to be able to do that better than us pretty rapidly in terms of picking stocks, trading. Some of these jobs that historically made a lot of money aren't, and so the trades are interesting, because I think AI won't be able to touch those as readily in a meaningful sense. And so, but you might imagine that you're not particularly interested in, I don't know, being a carpenter or something, right? So maybe two things strike me when it comes to sort of a man being competent. The first is I can fix a car because of YouTube, right? And so I didn't become a mechanic. And there's this great line in Shakespeare at the end where the apothecary is going to give Romeo the poison, and he says, "My poverty, not my will, consents," which is he's saying I'm giving this to you not because I want to, but because I'm poor and I need the money. And that's how I learned to fix a lot of things, not because I wanted to, but because I was poor and needed to. And there's something about that. I kid you not, some of the most awesome times I've had with my wife is when we're out with our head under the hood of a car trying to change an alternator, because I don't have $400 to do it. And I'm like, "Babe, you hold the flashlight," and she's trying to hold like that. No, like this. Come on. And I think part of what she respects is the sort of willingness and desire I have to learn in areas that I might not be competent, but I'm willing to try. And even if I'm not great at it, I had to build a chicken coop recently. And again, I'm on YouTube, and
can you clean the barf out of sheets?
I can clean I can get barf out of sheets. It's this sort of thing. So when you say men don't want an incompetent man, I kind of wonder in what domain do they want competence? Yeah. So for me, it's some sort of global willingness to show up and learn and try, but then also maybe in some sort of emotional IQ. I do think that seems important. Mm-hmm. That women don't just want a caveman. You want a guy who has some capacity to nurture and might actually be a decent father, who could nurture children, a sort of emotional competence. I don't know. Those would be my.
This, I think, is more of a you question, Matthew, is the one, how do we address the fears around commitment when divorce is common in our society?
Yeah, that was one of the themes that kind of came up in the questions. A lot of people said they were afraid of long-term commitment because they had seen their own parents' marriage. I think one thing you have to do is surround yourself by models of the kind of marriage you want. One thing that was really helpful for me was finding groups of people and finding places where people had the kinds of committed relationships that I wanted to imitate. And that's really hopeful. It instills and fosters a kind of hope where I say oh, they're doing it and it's capable of being done. And Sabrina mentioned these having older mentors or people in your life who can draw you up into where you're going and what you want, and can kind of help prepare you for that. But for me, that was a huge thing, and overcoming that fear. That was a fear I had getting married. And it was finding relationships and becoming and befriending those people. I had one couple, I was over their house every night, and I watched them raise little kids. And I watched them argue and fight and rupture and repair and forgive one another. And I watched them when they were tired but they were together and they didn't quit and they loved one another. And I was like, that gave me great hope. And they introduced me to other couples like them. And so I would say finding couples that give that sort of hope.
Manosphere and femosphere. The first question would be, do you think older generations understand this phenomenon of what's going on in the manosphere and what is going on in the femosphere? And then related to that, how do we discern the good from the bad, right? Because most of these people say one big truth and then 15 lies, and then another big truth and then another 15 lies. But once they reach a 15-year-old, they might shape the way they think. So how should we address this phenomena exists, right? These are influencers, they're out there. They write, they speak, they publish, people follow them. What should we do, and what should, people do? Should they share things among their friends or not?
Yeah, I mean, to your first question, I don't think that older generations have any kind of conception of what's going on for teens, for college students. Yeah, but I don't want to sound like a broken record, but when you ask, like, how can you sort out what's good and what's true and what's not, I think it has to come back to real life relationships with actual people. And I think it's really easy for, as I say, like all the structures of our daily lives kind of set us up to be sitting there scrolling and kind of consuming more and more content. And the way that the algorithms are curated, once you start listening to something going slightly off this way, then you'll be fed something slightly more extreme, and then slightly more extreme, and then it becomes kind of normalized, and that's all you're seeing. And so if you're starting with, say, the accurate and true insight that, like, men and women don't know how to relate to each other when men are, like, not doing as well, they're not graduating at as high rates, or they're having trouble with employment or things like that, that's a real problem, right? Like, I acknowledge that. But then it's very easy to start listening to influencers who are then trying to blame women for that, or say that we need to roll back equal protection under the law, or we need to take choices away from women so that they stop making the wrong choices, or we need to engineer a return to 1950s gender roles, et cetera. And there's, you can see that on the other side too. Like, there's, as you say, there's the femisphere who then are kind of engineering, who are very misandrist, right? Who are, like, hating men and think they're evil. And so it's really easy if you're just kind of interacting with the world through your smartphone for that to sound really, really plausible, and it gets reinforced over and over, and then that's the lens through which you're viewing the world. But I think you have to turn off the smartphone and actually look at a healthy functioning marriage, right? And see that having an educated, empowered wife doesn't mean that you're kind of taking the power away from the husband. There can still be a beautiful complementarity in that marriage. There can be, like, there's healthy models, I think, also where it's not, we were talking over lunch, where it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game between men and women. Like, if women are winning, that doesn't mean men are losing. And even speaking economically, like, a lot of people want to try to go back to 1950s era kind of male breadwinner, female homemaker model, kind of as a normative life script, which worked for a little while, but was actually really a historical anomaly, right? Like, it used to be that the household was the economic unit, right? Instead of having these, like, individual wage earners going out. So I think one of the things that's really interesting and encouraging to me that's happening now is a recentering of the home through even remote work, through, you can have a hobby farm too and work, whatever, like these ways where you can find kind of a flexible complementarity where you're saying, like, I am a woman and I'm different than my husband, and my kids need me, and my kids also need my husband who's a dad, and so we can sort of see the influencers are right about that. Like, it hurt people when we said that it didn't matter, right? But also, it's okay if it happens to be that I can more easily bring in a paycheck, and I might, we can kind of flex in and out. We can discern what's actually good for our particular marriage and our particular family, and not worry so much about fitting into a certain story. So I think just relationships with actual human people who are navigating that is the best antidote to kind of extremism on either side.
Again, too, there's it is fascinating on some level why these things take off and why they're so attractive. They're obviously touching or tapping some discontent broadly, but when you look at somebody like Andrew Tate or these other sort of figures, it seems to me that young men get really drawn and sucked into this because it's like somebody who's, for me, it feels like there's some issue around, like, not having an adequate father figure. Yeah. Like, I can't imagine one of my boys finding that attractive. And some part of that is because like I have a relationship with them and we talk, and I try to affirm them, and I try to let them know like I think they're great and they're wonderful and they're good, and they have virtues, and they're not forgotten, and they are loved, and they're like, I guess I don't know. There's something about, even I know depending on what, I mean, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, like so many young men found him so attractive. And again, I think all of these people say something true, and then they say like a bunch of sort of unnuanced things and get more extreme, and so you've swallowed the true thing, and then you end up swallowing the poison with it. But like, why is he so attractive? What is that? And I think some part of it for men is there's something about boys and dads that feels like I work with a lot of young men who feel like they don't have a relationship with their father, and they feel like their father doesn't really know them or see them or love them deeply. And I think that sort of lack of like affirmation, whatever that is, takes somebody like Peterson or Andrew Tate who says, hey, you know what? Like, you do matter, and you do, and you should be in the center, and like you should have what's yours, and you deserve it. You're kind of like, yeah, I should, like, but that should come maybe from your dad, and not in a toxic way, in a way that says like, you matter. Of course you do, because you're mine, and I love you, and I want what's good for you, and I want, like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think it's really interesting. I think philosophically speaking, it's interesting. We talk about gender roles being like socially constructed or innate or whatever. That's a big debate, right? But I think in a certain sense, women's drive toward motherhood is more biological, right? Like that unfolds within us in a way that's a little bit more out of our control. And I think men need more social scripts. They need somebody saying like, you are important. Yes. You need to sacrifice for your family. You need to protect them.
Yes.
And I think one big downfall of the mainstream feminist movement for the past 50 years has been kind of pathologizing masculinity and saying, we don't need you, we're independent now. And so that has left men really adrift, right? Yeah. They don't have something to give themselves up for, something to give meaning. And I think we need to recover that and say like, no, actually women and men need each other. Kids need their dads. Yeah. You need to man up and, stop online gambling, develop some
Video
mastery of
games.
your eyes, like do these things to become a man, to be able to be a good husband and a good father,
That's right.
Yeah, to your point, Matt, about the fathers and the boys, I think, and I think we've seen this a little bit in studies, but that it would be interesting to see how many women that decide to do OnlyFans had very present and very loving fathers, right? And I don't think the number would be very high. I might be wrong, but it sounds like that primal protection and affirmation does play a huge role in how we decide to move ahead with life. There was, I think this is going to be probably the last question, unless there's one more maybe coming then from the audience, because we ran out of what you wrote. You said something I think really beautiful about the waste of time, because some people mentioned, right, what if it's a waste of time? And what came to mind was some recent conversation where ultimately everything we do is not a waste of time, but we are using our time, right? So the question probably is not whether we will not be left with time, right? But is even being here today, having this kind of conversation, is it worth it, right? In the moment you're doing it. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I was thinking, you guys are married, but like things can happen in a marriage. One of the two can get sick, would it have been a waste to marry that person? Matthew, I saw you wanted to answer, but like, because if we think of like, well, but what if the relationship doesn't work? Then it's a waste of time. I mean, bring back wasting time. Waste time with people. You are gonna wait, but if you like wasting that time, that's a good way to waste time. Or am I crazy?
I'm not in favor of wasting time.
No.
Maybe on the micro level.
You're Northeast.
No, I think we need to restore directionality to, especially pre-marriage, right? Once you're married, you can waste as much time as you want. But this, I think, I mentioned, our model of marriage and family life works decently well for college-educated Americans, and it does. But I still think it leads to a lot of unnecessary heartbreak and just I guess like a holding pattern that, you know, you go from age 25 to age 32 and you didn't progress at all in that relationship. It's not good for you as a person, I don't think, but it's also bad because, if you'll let me, when you delay, if you're the person who wants to have kids and you think that it's a good thing to do and you want to do that, and you know, a lot of people do, if you wait until you're 40 to have your first child, it's a lot harder to you know, pick them up when they're running around as toddlers. The overlap of your life, you know, but if you have your first child when you're 25, I'm borrowing this from a friend of ours, but you know, you have more time together if you get married, if you start having kids earlier. Whereas if you wait until you're later in life, you only see your child until, you know, depending on what your life expectancy is, you know, the first 30 years of their life instead of the first 50 years of their life. I mean, that's time that you don't think about when you're in college or shortly thereafter, but it is a real trade-off. And so if we're not deliberate with the gift that we have, which is time, essentially, I do think that we worry that this model that sort of prioritizes career first and family. Again, there are ways it works, and you know, I'm glad that the people are able to make those trade-offs the best way they can. But that is a cost, and I don't want to minimize it by saying, take your time. You can up to a point, but after 2 years, like, all right, buddy, where's this thing going?
Yeah, and I want to clarify what I mean by wasting time isn't aimlessness or a lack of direction. It's the idea that unless something is a success, or I can guarantee it's success, or if it's a failure, then it has somehow been a waste of my time. And so I think we can go into relationships, and I hear a lot of kids going into relationships with this idea that unless I know that this particular relationship is going to end in marriage, why would I waste the time with it? And I guess what I'm advocating for is taking risks, directional risks, right? We're moving toward marriage. You shouldn't float aimlessly. You want to get married, you want to have a family, you want to be in a committed relationship, but taking risks that might not pan out. That's what I mean by wasting time, because I actually think it's a misnomer. I don't think they're actually wastes of time, but I think taking risks that might not pan out end up shaping a whole bunch of really helpful, healthy characteristics and virtues in you that will make you more marriageable in the future. Or it can. It doesn't always, but it can. And so when I say waste time, what I mean is go out for coffee with that person, even if you're not quite sure it's going to work, and you find out after the fourth, fifth, sixth coffee that, like, no, it's not there. I don't think that was a waste of your time. I think you're potentially cultivating the capacity for conversation, for actually leaning into and caring about others, for learning how to de-center yourself and think about and prioritize others. There's a whole bunch of helpful things you're doing, even if it doesn't quote unquote work. And so when I say waste time, what I mean is be willing to take risks to do things without 100% certainty that you're going to get the outcome you want.
Yeah, I don't know, Mark, if you want, but that's exactly, thank you, Matthew, for helping me say that better. Maybe also, that fifth or sixth coffee is also, in the meantime, you've exercised another virtue that is generosity. Yeah. I think it was Simone Weil, I read it yesterday, I think, that said that generosity with your time is the biggest kind of generosity you can show in life. Maybe this person is not really bringing much to your life right now, but you might be bringing something and also help them for the future. So we did have a long day. I don't think we wasted our time here today, and I hope that everyone agrees. So unless there are some final thoughts from any of our speaker.
One thing that stood out, and I'd love for the panel to know this, but one thing that stood out I imagine it was predominantly women who wrote this, but when asking about what their biggest fear about a first date was, there was not an insignificant number of women who wrote that they were afraid of being assaulted or physically harmed. And it was that actually really jumped out to me and struck me, that one of the fears or impediments to dating is a fear that you could be physically hurt or assaulted by somebody. So I don't quite know what to do with that. I mean, it probably is a confluence of factors. Part, like some of this, men that don't have role models, not knowing how to navigate social, like I don't know. Men that lack self-mastery, a whole but to throw out there that this is a real problem that, at least in the minds of some women, actually makes them quite hesitant, and should make them quite hesitant to want to go on a first date with somebody who they don't know, and so there might be workarounds there, that maybe getting to know somebody in a broader social context first, hanging out in groups first, I don't know, but I just thought that was worth noting, and that part of this conversation may be around these sort of ways that women feel pressured or are taken advantage of physically, that at least is in their mind. I don't know.
Yeah, not to sound like a brokered record again, but I do think that part of this is, if you're meeting potential first dates on an app where you have no shared social context and there's no accountability, like if a guy does assault you, like what are you gonna do? Versus if it's I went to a small group, right, like a small college, like whatever. If somebody did that, like there would be social consequences, right? And you also going into it, so that was a deterrent for him, right? Yeah. And also you had more of a sense of how he interacted with other people, and watching that person, how do they treat people who they have nothing to gain from? How do they, how do they talk to the cafeteria worker? Whatever, those are little things that actually give a clue to somebody's character. And when you don't have that real life in community feedback, I think it's very rational to have that fear.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Can I just tag on one very quick thought? I know we're keeping everyone here too long, but I think this also, moving back into real life away from online, is also partly we need women to not encourage each other in the sort of back channeling as well. I think having these interactions in person are healthy ways to see how people interact. But you hear so many stories of as soon as you get done with the date, you're texting the group chat about what he did and what he said, all this sort of stuff. I think that's actually another way that we sort of instrumentalize our relationships, where you're turning first date material, where the guy might be feeling incredibly awkward and not know what to say, into sort of, lighthearted comedy. I'm sure it's meant all in fun, but I think those kind of relationships maybe deserve a little more space to breathe before we immediately run to, can you believe what he said online? It's different, doing that over the breakfast table, but over a group chat, it seems to me that that's another way that technology kind of distorts some of these ways that we think about other people.
Yeah, I think we have a lens of mining our interactions for content too.
It does sound like we all need to become a little more virtuous, both men and women, right? Because the woman that gossips immediately about her date is probably not the best example. I wouldn't want her as a friend either. What do I want to say? Before we thank all the speakers, I just wanted to say that the Austinista has already been mentioned as a place where you can find great community. I would still think that's true. There are not many programs before the close of the academic years, but I know we have an event for women only on Tuesday. There's still a meeting of our men's group that I don't think is open to all, but you can still get in touch with the person who's organizing it, which is not me, it's a men's group, so don't have to worry about that. So you'll find the information about that on the website, and of course we're back with programs in August, and we're starting new programs for students, we have programs for professionals, so we are a very small organization, but the little we do it well, and we have good friends group and a good intellectual community, and parts of it, we're here today, but it's always growing, it's always changing. The house is never empty, so you can always drop by there. And with that said, I want to thank all our speakers, and thank you also for being here all day.